The story begins by showing a scene from the future. A massive swarm of monsters charges toward the protagonist, Yoo-won. The creatures are swiftly and effortlessly defeated, with the MC's weapon moving on its own. His movements are unnecessary. He remains calm among the monsters, swinging his club with his mind. The speed is so intense that the attacks are barely visible. Broken spears and goblin body parts fall to the ground. They are startled by the protagonist's hacks, who in turn looks coldly at the ugly monsters. A goblin archer even attempts to shoot an arrow, but the MC's weapon destroys it in midair almost instantly. The terror of the small monsters increases as they realize that even ranged attacks are useless. Mocking the goblins, the MC remarks, "You tried to attack in large numbers and even shoot arrows without warning. But if you thought I entered the dungeon relying only on that level of power, you were mistaken." Using some kind of magic, the protagonist transforms his weapon into a magic rifle. The monster horde launches its attack. The protagonist aims in their direction with the rifle, gathering energy as if preparing to fight. Air laser beam. The scene cuts back to the past, to the beginning of the story, showing the protagonist at 4 years old reading books. His parents were amazed to see the young MC reading. He was a genius. When they saw him reading books in foreign languages, they were even more surprised. His grandfather arrives, saying that the protagonist carries the lineage of his ancestors. He declares that the MC is the child born to fulfill the family's long-standing wish to conquer the Tower of Babel. A deep silence fills the room. Yoo-won's parents, tired of the old man's nonsense, ignore him. But the grandfather insists that the Tower of Babel is real. Grabbing some crayons and a notebook, he tries to illustrate what he means. The old man begins explaining that a long time ago, in a chaotic world, the great ancestor of the Ban family emerged. That ancestor possessed an ability that allowed him to communicate with everything. With this power, he led the people and built a tower that would never fall. This would be the Tower of Babel, says the old man, showing the drawing. You ask if a tower is like a building. The grandfather continues. Imagining a fortune, the MC wonders if the ancestor is the owner of the tower. The grandfather explains that the ancestor was a master of languages, and that they must remember they are descendants of a great man. More interested in the supposed building, the protagonist asks, "Where is the tower?" But the old man only says he doesn't know. This leaves little Yoo-won disappointed. Looking at his grandson with inspiration, the old man confidently says, "One day we will find the tower, and our family will reclaim all its power and glory." Whenever his grandfather told stories about the ancestor, the MC felt his linguistic abilities were extraordinary. He dreamed of fulfilling his family's long-held wish, but his abilities exceeded those expectations. Time passed, and the present day, the now-grown Yoo-won sat in his room, calmly in front of his computer, waiting for a response from the university. He had applied to the university's science and diplomacy department. The results were taking too long, which annoyed him. Suddenly, his computer started acting strange. This surprised him, and he tried to understand the source of the problem. A super-futuristic holographic screen appeared in front of him. He didn't understand what was happening or why it was there. The MC couldn't touch the screen with his hand, so he simply tried to read the strange characters he had never seen before. The text congratulates him on having his documents accepted for screening at the best academy in the alternate dimension. Now alarmed, Yoo-won has no idea what's happening or how he can read the message. A countdown appears, stating that once it reaches 0, he will be teleported to the evaluation site. The protagonist assumes it's some kind of prank or trick until a notification catches his attention. His computer returns to normal and notifies him that his university acceptance letter has arrived. While he is distracted by the admission letter, the teleportation countdown reaches 0. Without even noticing, Yoo-won is teleported. Enters her brother's room to see if he was accepted into the university, but she arrives too late to witness Yoo-won being teleported. He falls from the teleportation portal into a dark cave. The system screen appears, notifying him that the special exam for candidates from a lower dimension has begun. The system instructs the protagonist to defeat the blind goblins and destroy the dungeon core. Desolate, the MC screams in panic, insisting that he never signed up for this. Realizing his mistake, Yoo-won falls silent. He examines his surroundings and the monsters he can barely believe exist. Understanding that the goblins had noticed him and wanted to make him their prey, the protagonist remains even quieter. Still huddled in a corner silent, he considers how unbelievably similar this situation is to a game. Feeling the pain from his fall through the portal and the undeniable sense of reality, he understands that this is his new reality. He thinks about the system's description of the goblins being blind and how he has to fight them. The idea of having to fight monsters knowing that modern people run away from small gobs makes it seem even more difficult. One of the goblins nearly lands a critical hit on him. The MC isn't sure if any of the goblins have actually seen him. He remains quiet in the same spot while the goblins attack randomly, trying to find him. At the slightest audible sound, a nearby goblin hears and leaps to attack with a club. Won barely has time to see the attack. He dodges at the last second, but is slightly grazed. However, he manages to roll to the side, avoiding another hit. The MC shrinks into a corner, now even more silent. The goblins chatter among themselves. They know the MC is there and that he has nowhere to hide. While listening to the goblins' conversation, he realizes they have excellent hearing, and that they hunt by communicating to track each other's location. But now he has to think fast if he wants to survive. If he uses what he has learned about the goblins wisely, he might find their weaknesses. Yoo-won has no more time to waste. He needs to act fast, so he starts his plan by throwing stones into a corner of the cave. Hearing the sound of the stones, the goblins quickly rush in that direction. They must move fast to catch their prey. The largest goblin searches the ground for the source of the sound, but it only finds the stones. Acting quickly, the protagonist picks up a large rock. He throws it at a goblin's head. The goblin is easily tricked, thinking the prey is behind him. It immediately turns around in a furious attack. The head of the other goblin is struck by the blow. The one hit can barely remain standing. Speaking the goblin language, the MC tells the goblin that the prey endured the hit. The other goblin counterattacks, smashing its club into the head of its own ally. The MC's strategy works. Both goblins, having struck each other with powerful blows to the head, stop moving. Finally, one collapses on top of the other. The MC breathes a sigh of relief for having succeeded. He is still panting from the adrenaline. He looks at the defeated monsters for a moment. One of them is still alive, though only barely aware of what he must do. Who picks up one of the fallen clubs, looking down at the monster, determined to do what needs to be done. He tells the goblin, when someone tries to finish another off, they must be ready to be finished themselves. The protagonist hesitates, but knowing he can't hesitate any longer, he steels himself. To escape from here, this must be done. With as much mercy as possible, the MC puts the goblin to eternal rest. Golden runes appear over the bodies. The system screen appears. It congratulates the MC for hunting his first monster in the dungeon. As a reward, he gains the power of the superior dimension. The golden runes swirl around his body, seemingly filling him with power. A golden system screen appears, announcing that the power of the Babylonian code has been unlocked. This new power will be displayed using ideograms, symbols, or characters from a language familiar to the user. The protagonist wonders what these familiar ideograms might be. According to the system screen, Chinese characters have been registered. The common concepts of demon and life have been learned from the fallen goblins, while other concepts are either too complex or insignificant for the MC's current level of absorption. This new power of learning and absorbing shocks him. He wasn't expecting this. Until now, he thought his power was just about language, but it was much more than that. The ability to extract concepts from things seems somewhat vague. After absorbing 0.2 of the concept demon, the system explains that humans cannot possess this concept and recommends that the protagonist store it for use in an object. Curious about this, he decides to test it himself. The MC absorbs 0.4 of the concept life, increasing his vitality to 10.4. His general abilities and potential are enhanced, making him feel even more confident. He also absorbs 0.2 of the concept flesh, making him healthier. His strength and physique have genuinely improved. It's not just a sensation. The enhancement increased his grip strength, leg power, muscle density, bones, and even his skin became healthier. Yoo-won understood, learned, and fully absorbed the concepts from those goblins. Only the staffs remained from the absorbed bodies. The MC considered the best way to use his new abilities. He realized that absorbing concepts for himself and also fusing them into objects would increase his chances of survival. So that's exactly what he was going to do. All the dungeon monsters would succumb to the protagonist, who now possessed the hacks of the golden system. With his newly unlocked power, he cleared the dungeon of the blind goblins and destroyed the dungeon core. The blue system congratulated him for completing the practical test of the lower dimension admission exam, but instead of being returned home, he was teleported elsewhere, to a completely different world, the grand and unparalleled Union Academy. As he lay on the dormitory floor, the system congratulated him on becoming a provisional student. Without giving the MC time to think, the system ordered him to put on the uniform and attend the interview. Yoo-won didn't want to wear a uniform again so soon, but he had no choice. The protagonist found it simply ridiculous. They had put him in a near-death situation, and now they wanted to interview him just like that. When he found out who was responsible, he would express exactly what he thought in a very intense way. Now fully dressed in the uniform, Yoo-won walked through the corridors. The MC thought about demanding at least some compensation for the forced teleportation. All his thoughts crumbled when he saw the beauty seated in front of him. As he admired the woman, she pulled him out of his thoughts. She introduced herself as Yumina, the magic combat instructor at Union Academy. "Congratulations on passing the practical exam," she said. She proceeded to say that he was simply perfect, drawing the attention of the entire faculty. The instructor explained that he was the first student in 500 years to create a new artifact during the evaluation. She said it was an exceptional case, even by the standards of the special exam. The MC had grown tired of that strange place and planned to leave immediately after the interview. At least that was his intention until he felt something different, yet very familiar. Far away on the horizon stood a massive pillar. He asked the instructor what it was and what it was called. Yoo-won explained that the pillar was the reason the Union Academy was founded. At the academy, they trained the most talented students to reach the top of the tower. Yoo-won's aspiration and the final hope of all dimensions, the dungeon of all dungeons containing the secrets, dangers, and mysteries of that world, the Tower of Babel. It was, without a doubt, the tower built by his ancestor. Everything his grandfather had said about their family's history was right there. But the instructor had referred to the tower as a dungeon. Whether monsters had taken it over or if the Tower of Babel had always been a dungeon was a mystery. The glory of his family and all of his ancestors stood right before him, he thought, with a smile. The protagonist would reclaim everything that belonged to him. To pursue his goal, he enrolled in Union Academy. Thanks to special treatment from the instructors, he was teleported back home. Yoo-won reunited with his family to explain the situation and then prepared for enrollment. We return to the opening scene where the protagonist is holding a rifle in the Academy's lower dungeon. Inside a huddling cave preparing for registration, he gunned down the hobgoblins with ease. The monsters, obviously, stood no chance. After all, wooden shields don't protect against bullets. After putting all the hobgoblins to eternal rest, he checked his gains. All those kills earned him concept points, 3.4 in Demon, 6.8 in Life, 3.4 in Flesh, 0.34 in Murder, and 0.57 in Shooter. As the protagonist better understood his ability, he discovered that he could now verbalize, absorb, and manipulate the concepts of all objects. He could acquire the concept he recognized from the enemies he defeated, growing stronger as he learned and acquired more. Passing through the fallen hobgoblins, he failed to notice one that had survived. He sensed an attack coming from behind. Without needing a command, his living weapon took down the little monster. The protagonist had used the concepts he obtained in the blind goblin dungeon to strengthen the staff. By channeling ghost energy into the staff, he turned it into an autonomous weapon. Thanks to this unexpected creation, Yoo-won achieved a good result in the evaluation. After another series of kills, he checked his spoils, noticing something new and very interesting. The concept of soul, something he had never seen before. His autonomous weapon suddenly became strange. It seemed to crave that soul concept. Understanding his weapon's desires, the protagonist decided to give it a portion of the soul life. Thoughts of ghosts and spirits crossed his mind. He glanced again at the artificial being. The main character picked it up and noticed its personality was unchanged, though he still hoped the little serpent remained a magical weapon. He named the snake Eve. Before leaving the dungeon, he decided to check his own status. According to what he knew, life represented level, while flesh reflected physical strength. The abilities all-seeing eyes and all-hearing ears were related to linguistic skills. He asked Eve if she thought he could surprise others, but she shook her head. Yoo-won remarked that what truly mattered was the rate of growth. They teleported out of the dungeon. On their way to Union Academy for the entrance ceremony, they accidentally teleported straight into the auditorium, appearing suddenly and startling several people. Looking around, he saw many humanoid students. He activated all-seeing eyes, and upon examining their statuses, it became clear just how much stronger the regular students from higher dimensions were. The protagonist was stopped by a group. A strange-looking alien told him that those from lower dimensions shouldn't wander around. Yoo-won nodded in agreement, but kept looking for his seat, reflected that he already expected the inflated egos of those who entered through the regular process. Even here, the strong look down on the weak. His thoughts are interrupted by a student calling out to him. Those from special admissions sit there, the student says. The special admissions seats feel like exile. Something unexpected completely shocks him, making him question who those people are. There was no way they were from lower dimensions. Each of those three had incredibly high stats. They were almost the strongest ones there with absurd power levels, and the MC was the weakest. Yoo-won talks to one of them, who he already knew. He casually says, having seats specifically for special admissions students is amazing. That blonde guy is the roommate the MC met before heading to the entrance ceremony. The first time they met was a little unusual. The scene cuts to the memory of it, with the blonde pointing his sword at the protagonist and asking, "Who are you?" Panicking a little, the MC thinks before answering. Then he quickly explains, "I'm a new student and we'll be roommates." The blonde apologizes, saying, "I was just on edge because I had just finished the practical evaluation." In his thoughts, the MC notes that the blonde looks like a prince from a fairy tale. He asks the blonde, "Did you take the exam in the blind goblin dungeon?" To which the other responds that he didn't, since goblins are easy to hunt even for a complete amateur. Yoo-won starts a weird conversation, pointing out that they're talking without even washing up yet. Already taking off his clothes, he calls the blonde to shower since the dormitory shower is shared. The MC says they can continue their conversation while showering together. Panicking, the blonde tells Yoo-won to go first. Blushing and visibly embarrassed, he says he'll go after. Not understanding the reason for such a strange reaction, the MC stays quiet. The scene returns to the entrance ceremony. Only after all that reminiscing does the MC notice the other two. He greets them, and one of them greets him back. He starts admiring her beauty and says, "It's a pleasure to meet you." He also greets the other one, though with slight hesitation. The girl says nothing, making the MC even more apprehensive. She looks deep into his eyes. She says the thing wrapped around his arm is very interesting. He materializes Eve and asks if that's what she was referring to. He shows them the magical snake-shaped weapon, which fascinates the three of them. The blonde recognizes that the snake is an autonomous artifact, while the pink-haired one finds Eva adorable, and even asks to touch her. After seeing what she wanted, the white-haired one introduces herself. She is Dako Yan, daughter of a martial artist. The MC introduces himself as well. He is Banu-won. Innocently, he asks, do martial artists shoot energy balls? Finding the question amusing, the other three laugh subtly, still laughing. Your understanding of martial arts isn't entirely wrong, says Do. The pink-haired girl introduces herself. Her name is Rachel. The blonde introduces himself as well. His name is Light. The protagonist gets distracted when he notices instructor Yumina among the faculty members. Light asks, do you have a consultation with her? Yoo-won confirms that he did. The blonde says, I did as well. The lights shift in tone. Suddenly, the ceiling of the auditorium opens. A voice from nowhere declares that everyone has gathered. The pressure on the students is overwhelming to the point that they can barely remain standing. Even the mere presence of that being exudes immense pressure. Even the strongest students are greatly affected. The protagonist can't comprehend what this incredible pressure is. He realizes that whatever this is, it's in the sky. Looking up, the scene was surreal. Sty announced that the 2,557th entrance ceremony was about to begin. The scene shifts to the special admissions students in Professor Yumina's office. She asks, did you find the director's speech interesting? Silence fills the room. Breaking the silence, the protagonist says it was truly incredible and asks, was that eye the director? Not even the professor believes he actually saw the eye. Hugh thinks that the being was completely concealed using some special method. She looks at Yoo-won, wondering how he managed to see it. The protagonist explains it appeared as a giant eye watching everything from above. The professor confirms, yes, that was indeed the director. Seeing him again would be quite difficult. Yumina tells the protagonist, you'll have a private meeting with the director. She informs everyone, your achievements directly reflect on my reputation, so do your best. Light asks, will you be our assigned professor? Yumina confirms, yes, I will. She decides to introduce herself properly. My name is Yumina, and I am the professor of magical combat, assigned to class 11 for the next 5 years. The blonde asks, shouldn't special admission students normally have an associate professor? She explains, normally yes, but because you are so exceptional, the responsibility was given to me. Since they're all there, she decides to give them some advice. She warns them, be cautious of the envy and hostility of the regular students. It was just as the protagonist had expected. Envy and hostility far beyond normal competition, fights and conflicts between students that go beyond the internal school-sanctioned competition. The professor also advises them, always stay together. The agonist thinks they will need to be strong enough to ignore the jealousy and hostility. Yumina continues stating, you are also part of the team that will ascend the tower together until graduation. She closes that topic and informs them that the academy has prepared a small gift. The rules and details will be explained after they receive the artifact. A great light shines until the artifacts reveal themselves. Looking at the necklace in his hand, Light asks, is this a student ID? The professor explains, yes, the pendant serves as a student identification, allowing access to facilities and teleportation. With the pendant's magic, they can teleport anywhere within the kingdom. Due to a mishap by the blonde, the three of them suddenly teleport, but they return to their original spots soon after. Scratching his head, he awkwardly explains that to access the tower, the pendant is required, so they must take good care of it. Rudel asks the two why the protagonist stayed in the room. Light says he has no idea. Hugh speculates that perhaps that being noticed something. She recalls Professor Yumina speaking with someone on the phone. On the phone, the professor casually mentions that they were just about to have tea. Hugh had been paying close attention to the entire exchange. She thinks that the reason is likely because he was the only one who looked directly at the director. The scene shifts to the protagonist curled up in a chair. He was in the director's office. In his thoughts, he can only imagine that if he was in a private meeting with the director, he must have done something wrong. The director calls the protagonist's attention, telling him to look directly at him. After all, that wasn't his true form. The director, noticing that he was avoiding looking in his direction, reassures him that it's fine to look directly when he does. He sees a ragdoll sitting on the director's desk with no actual body present. Realizing this, he stares at the ragdoll, wondering how he should address it. Should he call him director or chancellor? But the director simply tells him, master will do. After that, the ragdoll says he will explain why he summoned him there. He states that he doesn't usually interfere with the students' growth. If they are weak, he lets them remain that way. He reveals that he has only one goal, to witness with his own eyes the one who reaches the end of the tower. The protagonist absorbs all the information the master shares, but then wonders why none of it makes sense to him. After all, the tower was from the time of his ancestors, and his family was determined to reclaim all of its power and glory. He had already decided he would risk his own life if necessary. However, his real question was what the tower meant to the chancellor and what it represented to the other students. He needed to understand why everyone was gathering in that dimension to climb the tower. Looking at the strange doll before him, he asks, what exactly is the tower? The ragdoll remains silent, but after a while he reveals the tower is a kind of path to the divine. Something like a trial. This made the protagonist feel a mix of sensations. He just wasn't sure if they were talking about the same concept of divinity, as if it were something related to religion. But before the protagonist could conclude his thoughts, the director continued speaking. He wouldn't interfere with the student's level of difficulty, but he would make an exception this time. It was because he saw potential in that boy, the greatest potential he had ever seen. With that, the puppet pointed at the protagonist, stating that he would prepare some things to help him. He made the protagonist's student identifier, which was in his pocket, glow. Not knowing what was happening, the protagonist kept asking, what's going on? The strange puppet explained that he had expanded the protagonist's external exploration privileges, allowing him to travel to any dungeon. That way, he could properly use his abilities before climbing the tower. This caused doubt in the protagonist, who asked the puppet, are you talking about the Academy's outer areas? The puppet confirmed, then created a portal beneath the protagonist's feet. It started sucking him in as the puppet gave him a few more instructions, saying that was all, but also mentioning that if his progress was remarkable, he would unlock more privileges. He still tried to ask what those privileges would be, and the puppet explained that he would be allowed to explore the tower alone. At that moment, he was fully engulfed by the portal, but managed to hear the puppet say that he was looking forward to it. It happened so fast that the protagonist was startled when he fell on the other side of the portal, landing on something soft. While the teacher asked how his meeting with the director had gone, he looked up and was startled to see her. This made him quickly stand up with a flushed face. The teacher stated that the director always dismissed visitors that way, saying the director had been expecting him from the beginning. They sat down and she grabbed the protagonist's identification. This surprised her, since the director had given a student permission to leave the academy. She explained that he could now freely explore the dungeons outside the tower. Now he understood, because before he had thought the director was calling him weak. That gentle teacher with flowers in her hair revealed her envy, calling the young man lucky. They talked a bit more, and after discussing several things, her eyes widened. She leaned in with an intense gaze and recommended a city called Ronica, which had a beautiful spring temple. After their conversation, some time passed, and he was walking along a long stone path. Looking up, he remembered when he had asked the teacher if he should bring something for her. Although the teacher asked for 1 or 2 bottles of alcohol, he didn't mind. He was more than satisfied with the trade. He was even more satisfied when he remembered something, his grandfather. His grandfather had given him a small pouch the last time they met. He recalled how his grandfather approached him, asking if he was ready. Then he handed him the pouch and told him to open it and take whatever he wanted. When he opened it, he discovered it was full of gold. He asked his grandfather if it was really okay for him to take all of it. His grandfather smiled, saying he didn't mind, affirming that the gold was the legacy of their ancestors. Before, he had thought gold would be heavy, even dangerous to carry. But now, with his inventory, it was different. Besides, his grandfather had said that gold was valuable all over the world. He decided to take only a few bars. After storing them in his pockets, all preparations were complete. Now he looked at the city. It was huge. Walking through the vast metropolis, even though it was another world, it seemed quite similar to Earth. Of course, there were some differences, such as flying motorcycles and cars. Seeing those things in the sky, he was impressed, wondering how they worked. Lost in thought, he was called out to by someone on the street. When he turned around, he saw 2 people approaching. One of them said, "We've never seen you before. Where are you from?" Then they quickly became surprised and asked, "Are you a student of the academy?" They promptly gave him a salute. After the young man introduced himself, the guards were curious about how he had arrived there. They explained that the city was peaceful, thanks to the hard work of the chancellor and the academy. Noticing that the protagonist was a newcomer, the guards said, "We can help you if you need anything." They were pleased to offer assistance, saying it was part of their duty and that he could ask them for anything. Seeing this, he pointed upward in the direction of the flying motorcycles. He stated, "I want one of those." As the guards looked up, the protagonist, smiling, asked, "How much do those flying vehicles cost?" Now on the flying motorcycle he had bought, the protagonist swiftly sped to the outskirts of the city, accelerating across the field. Jumping off a cliff with the bike, he was able to enjoy the wind hitting his face. The higher he ascended with the flying bike, the more incredible the sensation became. When he asked the guards about the bike, they revealed that the most basic model cost at least 250,000 runi. Curious about the value of the currency, Partner took out a gold bar and asked if he could exchange it for local money. The guards, upon seeing the gold bar in the protagonist's hand, widened their eyes, surprised and eager to know where he had gotten it. As he cut through the sky on the flying bike, he was still shocked to discover that the gold bar was worth more than 7 million ronia. Eva, the small white snake, suddenly appeared near the protagonist's shoulder. Excited, he asked her what she thought of the trip. He had infused demonic and ghostly concepts into the bike, turning it into a living artifact. The floating bike was named Lilith, and the MC wanted to get along well with it. Eva was pleased and greeted her new companion as they soared through the city's skies. As the MC approached a tower on the floating bike, he thought about how he had already obtained the liquor for the professor. He had created Eva's younger sister and completed everything he needed to do. Back at the academy, the protagonist had a massive headache and slumped over the table. Annoyed, Light placed a glass of water on the table and made it clear that he was disappointed. His furious gaze spoke volumes. After the group's meeting, the MC had left without saying anything. Even after apologizing and drinking the water, the MC tried to shift the blame to the professor, who had insisted he drink with her. Still, Light wasn't happy. He should have been informed. While eating, the white-haired girl noticed something on the protagonist. Spotting the emblem on his shirt, she asked, "Is that the symbol of the representative position you received for drinking with the professor?" The MC explained, "It's more like I've been appointed class president." While savoring his bread, Light seemed to agree, but when someone else voiced a different opinion, both were surprised. The white-haired girl was certain she was the most suited for the role. After all, she was the strongest among them. Saying this, she locked eyes with the protagonist. Although the MC remained silent, Light did not like hearing her say such things. He made it clear that he did not approve of her attitude, acting as if she were better than everyone else. The girl, seeing that Light did not agree that she was the strongest, reminded him that he had wanted to go to the tower alone. When his secret was exposed, the blonde was startled and even stuttered as he tried to explain himself. Things got worse under the gazes of the MC and Bella, the pink-haired girl, who said she was just curious. Tired and with a headache, the protagonist rested his face on the table again. Then, looking at the group, he realized that they had started off on the wrong foot. To make things even worse, he didn't want to be the class representative either, but he understood why the professor had chosen him. Looking at Light, he knew he was as stubborn and proud as a lion. The white-haired girl was strong, but prone to making enemies and acted like a stray cat. The pink-haired girl was as gentle as a newborn puppy. He sighed, searching for something to say that could ease the situation. Then he raised his hand, trying to get the others' attention. He argued that the class president didn't necessarily have to be the strongest. His words didn't seem to convince the white-haired girl, who was visibly irritated. The boy tried to explain that if the strongest person were the class president, they would make all the decisions alone. Meanwhile, the real job of the class president was to unite people. After hearing many arguments, disagreeing with some and accepting others, the white-haired girl finally stood up and accepted his decision. As the protagonist sighed in relief and expressed his gratitude, she looked him up and down and declared, "You're the only one who truly wants to lead." Locking eyes with him again, she stated, "Even if something bothers me, if I want to take what I desire, I'll have to accept unnecessary things as well." Light felt that the comment was aimed at him. Watching the girl as she left, he trembled with anger while the protagonist tried to calm things down. After the tension settled, he leaned back over the table again, feeling exhausted from the events, taking a moment to think about how to resolve the pride issues between the two. He was suddenly called by the pink-haired girl. She approached the protagonist with sparkling eyes and asked, "Where did that beautiful little white snake go?" His first mission as the representative of Class 11 started with difficulty. In the first class, a stone-bodied boy began shouting at the teacher. The protagonist's class was having a group lesson with other teams in a training field. It could be his group or even other students from different classes. Everyone was wearing training clothes. The teacher, standing in the middle of the field, asked everyone what they thought of his lesson plan. The regular students got excited, eager to volunteer for battle. They wanted to challenge the special admission students. At that moment, the protagonist put on a goofy face and Light showed no expression. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy quickly noticed that such a reaction was expected from Class 1. They all hated the special admission students, thanks to the Union Academy's ranking system. Amid the commotion, one of the Class 1 students noticed Professor Yumina's badge. Considering that guy weak, the stone-bodied student became furious when he saw him wearing the badge. He didn't care about knocking over other students with his loud shout and demanded that the teacher choose him as an opponent. The teacher saw the enthusiasm of all the students and found the proposal interesting. He set his sights on the protagonist and chose him to be Erector's opponent. The beautiful teacher, busy with several documents, even questioned why students were having joint classes with the special class. For a first period lesson, this was a practical and arrogant combat session. She couldn't understand who could have thought of something so disproportionate for the curriculum. The teacher announced there will be a direct confrontation with Erector. The young man simply remained standing, looking in the teacher's direction. At one point, he decided to raise his hand to share his thoughts. With a charismatic expression, he tried to be as respectful as possible, stating, "My abilities aren't very high." To the teacher, this was nothing but nonsense, so he deducted 3 points from his grade. Adjusting his glasses, the teacher made it clear that he would not accept weak excuses. Now it was up to the protagonist to quickly come up with a way out of this mess, because it was evident that the teacher wanted to humiliate him. Thinking fast, he said, "I was accepted as a special admission student due to unique abilities, but combat isn't one of them." The teacher became even more irritated upon realizing that the student was trying to slightly escape the confrontation. He shouted furiously, "I will not, under any circumstances, allow a student in my class to disrespect their teacher." As a result, he decided to deduct even more points from his grade. Not convinced and still believing he had room to maneuver, the protagonist raised his hand again. This time, he requested a week of preparation before the fight, assuring everyone that he would face the challenge once he was ready. His argument was that if he could have just 1 week off, he would be able to fight easily. After all, his preparations were already nearly complete. An absurd statement was heard and absorbed by all, leaving everyone in silence. After saying something so unbelievable, everyone in the stands began to see him as worse than trash. A young woman with blue hair and a pointed hat remained expressionless, merely observing everything around her. She thought he was suggesting that he could be ready in a week. However, she looked at him with suspicion, doubting that he could withstand the special class. Meanwhile, the teacher trembled with rage mixed with contempt, believing that this student was mocking him. The protagonist seemed lost in a distant world. Light, the worried blonde boy, didn't know what to do with him. Even though that man was just a substitute teacher, he was still capable of achieving certain feats. He asked everyone to pay attention because Banyu's fight against the director was now officially scheduled for 1 week from now. With a smile on his lips, he revealed that everything would be broadcast live on the Academy's website. Once again, the protagonist realized that this man just wanted to humiliate him and show off. Staring at the student, the teacher said, "Since you requested this time, you better demonstrate your skills." Pointing his finger at the stone-bodied boy, the protagonist replied, "I'm ready. We'll have part of the official match in a week." The stone-bodied boy, Erector, was annoyed by the protagonist's irritating way of speaking. With that, each went their separate ways, but the protagonist had already managed to assess his opponent. Erector, the stone-bodied man, had 250 health, over 300 physical strength, and used magic. But the protagonist was not impressed. This was expected from someone in the special class. The opponent's expectations were ridiculous, 5 times the health value and 10 times the physical strength. Even seeing reality right before him, he still believed that something could be done. As he observed the strength levels of his teammates, the blonde and the pink-haired girl, he saw they had incredible powers. After realizing he needed to become stronger, he declined the tower and joined them. He asked why they looked so upset. While asking Iris what was going on and why no one was speaking, he turned around and saw the white-haired girl stretching. She stated, "Unlike my partner, I specialized in combat. Since you all want to know more about our abilities, I'll show you." The protagonist, seeing that Duko Yan was openly challenging anyone, analyzed her powers. They were astonishing. She had a double S ranking and claimed she was more than willing to accept the battle challenge. Standing in front of her classroom, everyone remained silent, trying to dissuade her. All those from Class A, who had been eager to stir up trouble, were now completely quiet. Even the professor found it troublesome that someone of her level wanted to fight. The protagonist knew that none of them would dare volunteer. Even though his infinite reading eyes couldn't fully grasp the extent of her power, he still found it terrifying. She spoke again, challenging everyone there to a fight. Tired of speaking into the void, she pointed her finger at Hector. Then, with a mysterious aura, she gestured with her fingers, signaling him to come closer. She told him, "You can approach whenever you want. We will crush you." The protagonist was certain that Erector was terrified. His initial target had been the protagonist, but now he had become the target of someone far stronger. The protagonist knew that if the guy decided to fight, accepting the girl's provocations, he would be doomed. He would be so badly injured that he wouldn't recover in a week. It wasn't really any of the protagonist's concern, but he asked his friend to wait a moment. Rushing over to her, he asked her not to fight a rector because they had a match scheduled for next week. She wanted to know if he was sure about that answer. He quickly thanked her for her concern, telling her that he needed to prove his worth through his own abilities and hoped she would understand. Turning her face slightly and smiling, she said, "I thought you were just a guy with a few tricks, but maybe you're different." Satisfied, she said, "I'll let you handle things your way," and turning around again, continued searching for an opponent. She asked several times if anyone else wanted to participate, but everyone kept pretending not to hear. The silence was almost unbearable. She took a deep breath. She pointed out, "Just moments ago, you were all barking loudly, but now you've changed your mind." But when confronted directly, they all went silent. They crawled away, trying to hide in any corner they could find. Seeing that things had settled down, the protagonist, the blonde, and the pink-haired girl were feeling much better. Meanwhile, the guys who had been intimidated by the white-haired girl were furious. But they weren't the only ones feeling that way. Someone with horns in the stands suddenly spoke up. "Who are you calling a dog?" Exuding an intense aura, the blonde man with large horns stated, "It's always the weak and foolish ones who travel in packs. They wander around growling, pretending to protect their little roost." Now that he had the girl's attention, he continued, "Small dogs are a wonderful sight." He was arrogant as he claimed, "You'll never be able to protect that group." The protagonist looked at the man, unsure of what his intentions were. Observing him closely, he realized that even among the special class, this man was on another level. Light informed the protagonist that the man was Orma, a kind of regent from the Catuous dimension. The man stood up in the middle of the stands, even shocking his own companions. Among the 10 highest-ranking dimensions, including the Union, that man belonged to a ruling family of one of them. As the man descended, Light and the protagonist discussed how he was from one of the 10 most powerful families in the dimension. Ortama approached the professor, wanting to fight and make the fight official. The professor pulled out a recording device. Light told the protagonist that the professor was saying he would share everything that happened there online. Light was surprised to realize that Ban actually knew what the internet was, despite the fact that he himself didn't. As he searched through his inventory for a phone to watch the fight, Light complained about how Ban seemed to know more about the internet than he did. But all three of them were amazed when they found a channel broadcasting the Academy's classes. The pink-haired girl and Light asked the protagonist what was on the screen. When Ban saw the professor's expression as he made the fight public, he realized that the professor was actually trying to humiliate his group. However, looking at the white-haired girl, Ban knew things wouldn't go the way the professor wanted. The two combatants remained standing, staring at each other in the center of the arena as their auras surrounded them. Ortama, being arrogant, ordered Dew to make the first move. However, extending her hand, she called him a rookie. She stated that she would let him take the first move instead. He felt as if she was trying to humiliate him. Raising his hand, he intended to attack the girl to put an end to her arrogance. With his hand extended, the blonde man with horns ordered the girl to kneel. In the next moment, he spread all that energy toward Deko. The energy passed through her and extended to the protagonist group, making him feel the immense pressure. A tremendous pressure began to affect the stands, and even the protagonist felt it. Light felt as if he were being crushed by the air pressure, which made it hard for him to even breathe. Not even the protagonist group was spared, as everyone was feeling the same crushing force. The entire arena had turned into a massive battlefield. Ban knew that this was a distortion of natural law. His blonde friend was surprised when Ban managed to identify the principle behind that ability. Distressed, Luchiel gripped the protagonist's arm tightly, and he could tell that she was trembling. The pink-haired girl seemed afraid of her white-haired companion. The aura the girl emitted was extremely powerful and menacing. With just a single hand gesture, she erased the pressure the enemy was exerting on multiple people. This caught the teacher, the opponent's team, and even Light by surprise. Even the protagonist, who already knew her strength was absurd, noticed that she had grown even stronger. With just one movement, she crushed the opponent's ability. He realized that the girl had a certain level of mastery. After hearing what the man said, she retorted, "Your power is as ridiculous as your horns." The two began exchanging verbal insults about each other's strength. In the blink of an eye, the young woman swiftly approached the blonde man with horns and launched a kick at him. He made a fool of himself when he was caught off guard, and she warned him, "I won't let you use the same ability twice." She continued attacking as his moves were too predictable. She was going to knock him down. The blonde man with horns was frustrated. He had to use both hands to block her attack, and he still had to hear her taunt him up close. "Since you have no technique, you'll have to rely on your body," she said with a smirk. With no time to react, he was struck again. When he tried to counterattack, she dodged effortlessly. When he attempted to grab her arm, she slipped away and delivered a kick to his chin, forcing him to stay alert. Her insults only made him angrier, and he couldn't take it. He kept trying to fight back, but she was far too fast. The fight was so overwhelming that Light and the protagonist could hardly believe what they were seeing. Light couldn't believe she was overpowering a governor. Yoo-won was truly an interesting girl, the protagonist thought, with precise movements and quick counters. The protagonist noticed that the opponent was trying to suppress her movements. That way, he could defeat anyone, as that was the distortion of natural law. However, things weren't going the way he was used to. The girl wasn't giving him any openings. He was constantly getting hit without being able to land a single attack on her. The protagonist realized that Ortma's method wasn't working against the white-haired girl. The opponent's situation was growing more difficult. It was clear who was leading the fight. The protagonist thought that while they both had incredible powers and physical abilities, the man didn't always rely on his body. From up close, Light found it strange that the protagonist could notice this just by watching. He wondered how the protagonist was able to pick up on such subtle movements. The girl kept growing stronger in the battle. Ortma felt increasingly insulted with each consecutive hit from the girl. She wasn't holding back at all. It was obvious that she wanted to finish this fight as quickly as possible. She asked, "Are you here just to talk, or are you actually going to show some results?" Under extreme pressure, the man released his aura, launching a powerful attack aimed at her. Shouting, he accused her of deliberately trying to humiliate someone like him. His eyes sparked with flames as he swore he would never forgive her for treating him that way. He declared that she would have to pay with her life for insulting him in front of everyone. She simply stared at him. Upon seeing her opponent's reaction, the young woman decided to remain calm, observing and waiting for the right moment to strike. Facing the enraged man, she declared, "This is not a concept someone like you should be discussing." Sensing that her opponent might attack, she released her aura, her hand clenching slightly. With a threatening presence, she charged forward. Her opponent, seeing the girl approach, tried to prepare himself. Even so, she simply stared at him calmly, ready to face him. But she was interrupted when the sound of clapping suddenly echoed through the arena. It was the beautiful professor who had stepped in to stop the battle, causing both of their auras to dissipate. As a vast field of flowers bloomed across the arena, it was as if spring had taken over the space. The sight surprised both fighters as flower petals floated gently through the air. The beautiful professor, who seemed to bring spring with her presence, reprimanded the students, stating that the academy did not encourage fighting. With a radiant smile, she advised them to save all that strength for the tower. The flowers that covered the arena and the stands brought with them a profound silence. The protagonist wondered if all of this was an illusion, though he could clearly smell the sweet fragrance of the flowers. Despite the battle being interrupted by the professor, the two students continued to stare at each other with intensity. Frustrated, the blonde with horns clenched his teeth and prepared to leave. He simply turned his back and walked away, leaving the professor behind without pushing for the fight any further. To praise the professor for being very strong. Hearing such a compliment from such a promising student, the beautiful professor was satisfied. She simply turned and walked toward her own group. Seeing her being welcomed by the protagonist and the others, she was curious to know what the protagonist thought of the fight. He commented just watching was already a great help. But before he could say more, he was headbutted by the pink-haired girl. Startled, he looked back and saw Rutel trying to hide behind him, using him as a shield. The girl was trembling. When he asked if she was still afraid of her colleague, she hugged him even tighter. He had to calm her down while the white-haired girl remained standing in front of them. Unaware of this, a scolding was taking place in front of the students. Yoo-won was reprimanding the assistant professor, saying he deserved punishment. Since he had started a fight session on the very first day of class, he simply shrank under her scolding and apologized. She turned away, clearly displeased, stating that the situation would not be resolved with just an apology. Walking up to the protagonist, she pointed at the brooch on his chest as she got closer. She said that for a class representative, dignity was everything, and she flicked his flower brooch. Then she looked him in the eyes and asked how he could wear the brooch in such a way. All the male students watching the professor's interaction with the special admission student were filled with envy. Fully aware of the reaction she had provoked, the beautiful professor bid farewell to the protagonist and his group, looking at the angry faces of the first-year students. The protagonist sighed. The professor had made things worse rather than helping. Now she had thrown more fuel on the fire, leaving everyone even more furious with him. After the arena battle, gossip quickly spread across the academy about the student from a lower dimension who had faced Ortma on equal footing. The rumors got worse once the recording surfaced. Many soon realized that the fight had been practically one-sided, with the guy being caught off guard repeatedly. Rumors about the new students, especially the pink-haired girl, began to spread. Comments about her being adorable circulated widely. Some students from Ortma's class tried to defend him. However, all the claims were quickly debunked once everyone watched the recording, which had been posted by the professor. Soon, the silver white-haired girl started drawing attention from everyone. However, the comments weren't only about her. There was a lot of talk about a student who had been bargaining. He was being called the master of bargaining. When Professor Yoo-won appeared in the recording, everyone was shocked. Speculation exploded when they saw her interaction with that student, the master of bargaining. Soon, throughout the school, students became eager to learn more about the newcomers from special admission. Reading through the video comments along with his group, the protagonist remarked how it seemed like the whole world was talking about them. Beside him, Light was practically melting in his chair from reading so much slang in the comments. Next to him, Dako said, "It isn't surprising that we're being talked about," but then she brought up something that shocked everyone. She mentioned that the guy she fought wasn't truly the strongest. She recalled a girl sitting quietly with a large hat. "There's at least one more person in that class who's more capable than him," she said. She was surprised when she noticed that the protagonist hadn't realized it. He just laughed, shrugging his shoulders, and said, "I was too focused on your fight." While reading the comments, Light reported that the protagonist's name was spreading throughout the school community. At that moment, in the middle of the conversation, Light wanted to ask something. He looked toward the pink-haired girl. She was sitting at a distance, far from them. She trembled while looking down. The boys fell silent, and the protagonist noticed that the girl was terrified of Deko. She couldn't even get close to her. The situation was probably worse since the two of them shared the same room. The protagonist then opened his inventory, taking something out while asking, "Should I use this to try to comfort her?" A jar appeared on the table, catching everyone's attention. It was a jar of special elixir jelly concentrated from hundreds of fruits and carrying a unique effect. Because of that, his two companions stared at the jar in awe. Seeing their reaction, the protagonist decided to open it. Rutshell, who was sitting a bit farther away, suddenly started to smell the aroma of the special jelly. As soon as the scent reached her nose, she immediately lifted her head, opening her mouth. Turning to the side, she saw the various pieces of bread with golden jelly that he was handing to the other two. Light and Dew took the bread and each took a small bite to taste it. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy was amazed when he bit into the bread, while the girl almost lost her cold-hearted composure. Light wanted to know how the jelly could taste so good, while the girl stuttered, unable to find the words to speak. Smiling, the protagonist asked, "Is the jelly good?" Light was euphoric. Dew said it was incredible and that she had never eaten anything so delicious. Hearing that, the protagonist turned to the side and called Rel, who was already drooling with the desire to taste the jelly. He then invited her to eat with them. Closing her mouth, the young girl slowly approached the protagonist and asked him to prepare a piece of bread with jelly for her too. Once it was done, she held it in her hands and took a big bite, visibly amazed by the sweet flavor. Rachel felt that the taste was the most delicate fruit flavor she had ever experienced. After finishing her meal, the white-haired girl licked her fingers and said that she felt as if she had eaten something precious. While spreading more jelly on a piece of bread, the protagonist revealed that making the jelly wasn't expensive. As Rachel savored the jelly-covered bread, the protagonist handed another piece to Dew, telling her to consider it a favor. Hearing those words, she suddenly stood up and declared that she had made a decision. Saying that, she grabbed the protagonist's tie, pulling him close while he was still trying to eat his bread. She said that she would personally give him martial arts lessons in exchange for the jelly bread, adding that they were transported to another place, a training room. Looking around, the protagonist commented that the room reflected his psychological environment. While wondering what DOA was going to teach him, he waited for her response. Having just come from their meal, the girl approached a section and picked up a wooden sword. Then she swung the wooden sword, creating a small gust of wind, advising the young man not to move carelessly. She took a firm battle stance with the sword and stated that their lesson was about to begin. In the next instant, she released a sense of pressure and charged at the protagonist. With a thrust, her attack sent a gust of air toward him. As she placed the tip of the sword near his nose, he stared at it with a blank expression, seeing the blade so close. The young woman explained that move I just executed was a thrust. She said it was a thrust without a trace of doubt or hesitation. But to the protagonist, it was hard to believe that a piercing attack could be executed by a human. However, in a brief instant, Vandy recognized a new concept within her attack. The concept the protagonist learned was penetration. He wondered why he had learned this concept. Trying to reflect on it, the protagonist drifted into deep thought. Even as Dew called out to him several times, he couldn't snap out of his daze. When he finally returned, he apologized. She asked him to focus, stating, "A thrust doesn't have just one form." She explained that what she was showing him at that moment was the most basic foundation of a thrust's meaning. Then she began performing multiple thrusts in the air in different ways and asked him, "How many times do you think you should thrust and from where to where? What should you imitate while thrusting?" He also wanted to know, how much force should the aura have when executing a thrust? Every question she asked was followed by a movement until she was standing in front of Yoo-won. That was when she explained that there were numerous variables. She stated, "The supreme foundations require only a single thrust, and you should never forget that." Faced with this lesson, he reflected on the things the girl had said. Her actions, which had mastered a concept down to its final form, carried a deeper meaning. More than just various concepts combined for her, the attack seemed to embody the essence of truth. After giving these instructions to the protagonist, she handed him the sword so he could try it himself. Holding the sword while she observed, he asked her, "Please don't laugh at me." His imitation wasn't accurate. As she watched the protagonist's movements, she couldn't help but smile. She stated, "If you could copy me perfectly, then the 10 years I've trained would mean nothing." While she demonstrated, he carefully mirrored her movements. When she saw his blade cut cleanly through the air, she was genuinely impressed. Watching his stance, she realized he had quickly understood the core of the technique just by observing. Yet, the protagonist felt his first attempt was not enough. Determined, he steadied his focus. He knew he couldn't perfectly copy the skill she had displayed. Until now, he had tried blending several techniques, but now he aimed to master each one separately. Slowly, he recognized that his previous approach needed adjustment. Removing his outer layer for freer movement, he prepared to try again. He concentrated deeply, sensing his strength growing stronger within. Performing several precise thrusts, he reflected carefully. The technique had many nuances, and he wondered why he was taught the concept of penetration. At last, the reason became clear. The teacher who passed on this skill believed a true thrust should pierce completely through its target. With this understanding, the protagonist directed all of his energy and focus into his next strike. This time, his blade sliced through the air with much greater power, as if he and the thrust were one. The young woman, watching his movements, she told him to stop. He dropped to his knees in exhaustion. She remarked, "There's no reason to wear yourself out so much." While he tried to catch his breath, she added, "Remember what I demonstrated. Try again." The moment she finished giving her instruction, several notifications appeared before the protagonist. He had comprehended the concept of martial arts. He had also absorbed the concept of swordsman, adding it as a sub-concept. He was shocked to have achieved this after swinging the sword only a few times. When he checked his stats, he was startled. All of them had skyrocketed. The concept of swordsman, which hadn't increased even after defeating countless enemies, had also risen. The protagonist was in disbelief. His average combat skills had doubled. Looking at him, the young woman admitted, "I never thought I could lose like this." She noted, "You embody the essence of free technique." Intimidated by her, he scratched his head. This only irritated her more when he said, "I was just imitating." Hearing that he had learned so easily because she had been the one teaching him, the young woman blushed slightly. Seeing that she had calmed down, he continued explaining his actions. He mentioned that he could feel the depth of her movements. After hearing all these comments from the young man, she felt moved but didn't want to show her emotions. She turned away, avoiding the words of someone she had only just met. Satisfied, the protagonist thanked her for teaching him such great techniques and offered her an elixir. When she said that just one elixir wouldn't be enough compensation, he was startled. He was unsure of what else he could do to repay her. Seeing his concern, she told him not to worry. With a beautiful smile, she assured him that she would collect her compensation in due time. She then told him to be prepared, completely shifting the mood. Informing him that the next class would be starting soon, she called him to leave quickly. They teleported out of the training room, and he scratched his head. He still remembered the beautiful expression on Du's face at that moment. Inside the academy, the pink-haired girl along with the blonde was walking through the hallways. As they looked at a phone, Rel suddenly bumped into a few rough-looking students from other classes. The student in front of her placed his hand against the wall, demanding her attention. The man seemed persistent, and the young girl, though not showing it, was clearly uncomfortable. Seeing that someone was bothering Rutel, Light stepped in between them. The young man was visibly irritated by Light's arrival. He stared at him and asked what he wanted with his classmate. The student from the other class became even more annoyed. He called Light an insect and told him to leave. At that moment, the protagonist and the white-haired young woman arrived in the hallway via teleportation. The group noticed their arrival and went on high alert. Yoo-won also noticed the presence of the students and wanted to know what was going on. Upon seeing the famous Deco, the other students fled, leaving behind only a threat. This time, Rutel hid behind Light, thanking him for defending her. As the protagonist tried to understand what was happening, he asked Light something, but he quickly realized that Light was too irritated to respond. Moments later in the classroom, the teacher was giving a lesson on the history of the Union. During class, some students secretly took photos of the pink-haired young woman. These troublemakers were the same ones Light and Rutel had encountered before. Faced with so many irritating comments, the young woman became sad and upset. Light and even the protagonist were bothered by the situation. Yoo-won realized that no matter the world, people would always be the same. Annoyed by the students who wouldn't stop making noise, Light suddenly stood up, catching the teacher's attention. The teacher asked, "What you want?" Light explained, "Other students are making it difficult for me to concentrate." With the student's request, the old professor ordered the troublemakers to be quiet. After that, he simply turned back and continued his explanation about the Union Academy. Even so, the group resumed mocking Light, calling him Maeve. They said he was just trying to show off because he was good looking. After a while, they started making comments about the young woman, asking, "Are you and Light dating?" The more they spoke, the more uncomfortable Ruto became, to the point of silently tearing up. At that moment, Light completely lost control. Demonstrating his anger, he snapped a pencil in his hand. Calmly, the protagonist placed a hand on Light's shoulder and asked, "Calm down." Light, in disbelief, looked at the protagonist and asked, "You're really asking me to calm down?" The protagonist took out his phone and said, "Causing trouble during class will only make things worse." He asked Light to calm down and look at his phone. On the floating screen, he was live streaming a channel from YouTuber on the internet. Hearing what the protagonist said, Light realized what he was trying to do. Laughing mischievously, he wished for the boys to keep talking, since everything they were saying in class was being broadcast. The three fools had no idea that a camera with audio was right behind them, recording everything they had said from the beginning. The one holding the camera and filming them was Lil Eva. It didn't take long before hundreds of comments flooded the video. Du praised the protagonist's initiative for taking action. He stated that he wouldn't let them go unpunished after what they had done to their companion. By the time the three realized they were being filmed, it was already too late. They tried to hide from the camera and began searching for it. At one point, one of them spotted the snake holding the camera in its mouth. Before they could grab it, the snake vanished. When they looked toward the teacher, they realized there was no escape. At that moment, hearing all the noise again, and the teacher for the first time became irritated. Losing patience, he simply asked for their names and ordered them to leave the classroom. The three had no way to avoid expulsion. After that, the teacher resumed his lecture, muttering that he would give them low grades even though they were expelled and received bad grades. The protagonist thought the punishment was too lenient. However, Runtel said that it was enough and thanked both of them. With a bright smile, she added, "I'm fine, thanks to you staying by my side." The protagonist tried to be humble, saying, "I didn't do much. I just thought of a way to solve the problem and acted." Rutel listened to what he said and simply smiled. Light did the same. Even the usually grumpy white-haired girl showed a small smile. The three agreed that things were easier now that the protagonist was their class president. After class, as the protagonist group was leaving, the three fools returned to cause more trouble. Scared, the pink-haired young woman hid behind the protagonist. The other members of the group grew irritated with the seemingly endless situation. This time, the three troublemakers were armed and glared at Light, who calmly asked, "What do you want?" Faced with the three irritating young men, Light remained calm the entire time. As several other students observed the scene, the leader of the three demanded an explanation about what had happened earlier. The other two were angry because the recording had ruined their grades for the semester. The protagonist looked around and saw the professor calmly observing the situation. He noticed that the professor had seen the three students drawing their weapons but did nothing. Yoo-won thought that they acted without any regard for students from lower dimensions. Suddenly, the three fools became even more irritating and started yelling at the blonde. Light, being very composed, decided to repeat his words again. With little expression on his face, he stared at them and called them barbarians. Offended by such words, the three began trembling with rage. The leader of the three fools pointed his sword at Light, asking if the inferior creature had anything to say. Faced with the scene, Light, still calm, drew his sword and made a light fan-like motion in the air. With a casual movement, he sliced the other student's sword in half. The severed blade flew away, shocking both the protagonist and the others as they watched Light's technique. The MC analyzed his blonde friend's strike with his all-seeing eyes and managed to learn a new concept. He could see that Light's sword was surrounded by golden energy shining like sunlight. Shocked to see his sword reduced to half, the fool trembled in fear. Irritated, Light held his golden sword and placed it near the man's neck. Hearing such harsh words, the man did nothing but drop to his knees, terrified of what could happen. He even heard Light say, "If you ask politely, I might agree to talk." Light gazed down at the man with a cold look on his face. Watching the whole scene, the protagonist sensed something strange about Light, as if his personality had completely changed. Light rested his sword on the man's shoulder, commenting, "I enjoy the current silence." After seeing the fool kneel before him, he took it as a form of greeting. On his knees, the opponent gritted his teeth, unable to move his own legs due to the immense pressure weighing down on him. His friends tried to help him, shouting insults at Light, while the white-haired girl watched the situation unfold. She kept a stern expression, clearly disapproving of Light's actions. At that moment, Light surprised everyone by calling out to the professor. He asked, how does the academy evaluate a group that suddenly attacks their classmates with real weapons? Clearly uncomfortable, the professor coughed and looked away, stating the academy encourages combat training within certain limits. However, with his eyes fixed on the professor, Light retorted, "I never agreed to the match." Trying to turn the situation against Light, the professor claimed that he was the one who started it by drawing his sword. The protagonist grew tense, watching Light argue with the professor. Frustrated, Light asked, "How do you plan to handle the insults that have been thrown at me?" The professor thought for a moment before answering. "I haven't seen anything that would make you completely lose your composure." Light's fury rose, and the intensity of the aura surrounding his sword grew with it. As he questioned the professor about the meaning of his words, his anger intensified even more. It was at that moment that someone intervened, kicking him on the forehead. Dew dispelled Light's aura before he even realized she had arrived. The impact made his head jerk back, snapping him back to reality. Light straightened up, staring at the young woman, trying not to tear up from the flick. Dew pressed lightly against the spot where she had hit and asked, "Do you realize you've been acting like a tyrant, waving your sword around?" Still dazed, Light made his sword disappear. Yoo-won felt relieved to see his friend's aura fade, while the professor muttered to himself. Realizing he could no longer control the situation, the professor turned his back and walked away. Cursing the group, the protagonist, still with Rutel hiding behind him, observed the scene with curiosity. Looking at the young woman, he asked, "Wasn't the situation a bit too dangerous?" Now everyone watched as Dew scolded Light, asking, "Is it in your nature to yell angrily all the time?" Later, inside the academy, while they were having a meal, the protagonist absent-mindedly tapped his plate. He took the opportunity to tell his companions, "If you keep acting recklessly, you won't be well received at the academy." Hearing this, Light jumped up and tried to defend himself, claiming, "I wasn't the one causing trouble." But the protagonist was furious. The blonde tried to apologize for causing an incident with a professor. Meanwhile, the white-haired girl watched their argument, humming as she ate jelly with bread. Regretful, Light listened as the protagonist reminded him of what had happened earlier. If you had acted normally at that moment, the situation would have been resolved quickly. But Light seemed to have suddenly changed his personality, as if something was controlling him. In the end, the protagonist accepted that it was probably caused by Light's golden sword. Annoyed, Light stood up but insisted, "I can definitely control the sword." Seeing his friend's stubbornness, the protagonist simply smirked mischievously. Finally, he sighed, having nothing more to say. He decided to believe that Light could control his power. Beside him, the young woman, listening to his excitement, finally spoke. She surrounded herself with feline-shaped arrows. After hearing so many words that did nothing to encourage him, Light slumped over the table, frustrated. Suddenly, the young woman called the protagonist to discuss another matter. She recalled the teacher's advice, who had warned them about the envy of regular students. The teacher also said that if they continued to show so much strength, their school life would become even more difficult from that point on. Therefore, they needed to think about the future. Looking at the protagonist, the young woman asked him to share his thoughts. She wanted to know what the class representative had to say. Now he had to respond. He thought for a moment. At that moment, he began to realize what was truly disturbing the superior mentality of that place. This mentality was based on birthright or innate strength, along with a strange disdain for lower dimensions and a completely outdated system. This entire structure made it impossible for outsiders like them to have any influence in that place. The protagonist did not reveal his thoughts, but instead posed a question to the group. He wanted to know what it took to gain the favor of a large group. After hearing the question, the trio tried to guess the answer, suggesting that power might be the key. However, the protagonist said it was something else, something they already had. Forming a square with his fingers, he mimicked a camera and, looking at the trio, revealed the answer: appearance. After that, he devised a plan which piqued the white-haired girl's curiosity. She wanted to know why they should create a channel to showcase their daily activities. The protagonist explained that he wanted to build a public image, something that would help change how people perceive them. With that in mind, the four of them went to an arena. Lighting equipment was set up to assist with recording, while the protagonist held his phone to film. Despite all the explanations, Light still didn't understand why they needed to fight. Seeing his hesitation, the protagonist warned that the fight wouldn't just be an act, it would be real. As soon as he finished speaking, Deco charged at Light, who still wasn't taking the fight seriously. While fighting, the young woman complained to the protagonist, saying he worried too much. At that moment, she grabbed Light by the collar and threw him to the ground. She stated after taking a few hits, anyone would start taking the fight seriously. The protagonist, surprised, filmed the young woman going after Light. The blonde boy got up cautiously. The ground was already destroyed from the impact. While the young woman looked at him with a teasing smile, provoking him, she said, "I finally understand why you were so confused when using the artifact last time." Showing her superiority, she suggested, "Pick up the sword again. Maybe that will help you get close to me." After several provocations, Light became deeply irritated and charged at the young woman. Meanwhile, the protagonist became even more excited about the recording, which slightly worried the pink-haired girl. Rutel still didn't understand how this could make their school life easier. As Light and Dew's fight continued, the protagonist smiled and said, "The results might not be immediate, but if those who constantly bother us realize how skilled we are, things might change." The recorded fight grew more intense, but at the same time, he kept talking. The protagonist told the pink-haired young woman, "Don't worry about the outcome of the fight. Your beauty is far too precious to be ruined." She was confused by the comment as he pinched his own cheeks. Then he asked her, "Have you never heard that a pretty face looks even better with a smile?" After that, he added, "You have a face capable of charming anyone." After a few minutes of fighting, Light began retreating while the young woman chased after him, asking, "Where do you think you're going?" Later, in another place, Ruto was seen crying, but not out of sadness. For the first time, she was tasting a bowl of noodle soup. Following the protagonist's advice, the group members started recording and posting their daily routines. The response to the channel's videos was explosive. After the video of Light and Doo's fight, numerous comments flooded in. Many were impressed by the beauty and power of the white-haired young woman, while others wanted to learn more about the group. Other videos were also published, including one where the group played a board game. In it, some people already knew the rules and explained them to the newcomers, while everyone had fun. Another video showed the group's meetings with the beautiful teacher, which generated a flood of comments. Viewers praised the beauty of the young women and the teacher, as well as the variety of teas served at these gatherings. They also reacted to funny faces while trying new foods. After several students watched the videos already published on the channel, many wanted to move on to the next one. However, they realized that the next video was not an ordinary one, but a live broadcast scheduled for the next day. The next day, the protagonist and his group were stunned by the number of people gathered to watch the live stream. Some didn't even understand how they had managed to attract so many viewers. As the group chatted excitedly, Professor Yumina approached. While walking toward them, she commented on how the uni was filled with higher dimensions brimming with true wonders. She then praised their channel, highlighting how it showcased the group's daily life and created a connection with other students. Taking advantage of the situation, the protagonist annoyed Light again by mentioning the impact the first fight video had caused. However, they quickly changed the subject as that was the day they would climb the tower. Yu stood beside the protagonist wearing his special outfit for the ascent, just like Rutil and Light. That was when the protagonist noticed something curious. Everyone was dressed differently except for him, who was still wearing his school uniform. When he tried to understand the situation, the girls explained that since they would face successive battles, they had prepared with more appropriate clothing. Someone asked if he would be fine wearing just his school uniform. At that moment, he remembered his origins in a peaceful place. However, he had already made the decision to risk his life. Adjusting his tie, he firmly stated, "The clothes I wear are enough for me." Once everyone was ready, the beautiful teacher made a gesture with her hand. With this movement, a large magic circle appeared on the ground, covering the area where they all stood. The circle shone brightly up to the sky and then transported everyone within it. The light gleamed before the enormous building that housed the tower. Along with the professor, Class 11 was taken to the new location. Many of the students present noticed Class 11's arrival and recognized them because of the videos. Worried, Ruptual looked around trying to understand where they were. The professor explained that they had arrived at the tower's entrance and that it had been open since early that morning. As he gathered with his group, Light noticed the presence of some familiar faces. A bit further ahead stood the three troublemakers who had recently tried to provoke him. Even after the protagonist revealed that they were merely followers, they remained unfazed. However, she warned that there were still malicious gazes directed at a rector. She only wanted to alert him once, but he already knew what she was going to say. After all, that was the day he would begin climbing the tower, and the following Tuesday would be the day he faced a rector in a duel. The protagonist, however, didn't care at all about his opponent's presence. Without hesitation, he simply called the others to move forward. There was little time until the duel, and he needed to grow stronger by advancing further into the tower. The professor wanted to give some safety instructions and asked them to finish the exploration early. The protagonist listened attentively, and when the professor asked how long they planned to explore the tower, he wondered if he could answer on behalf of everyone. The others agreed. Clenching his fist with determination, he declared they would stay for 2 nights and 3 days. As he spoke, he opened his hand, and a small device appeared, a mini video camera. Watching the group's growth, the professor smiled and reminded them to be careful. And so, as the small camera floated, the protagonist led his team into the tower. Inside him burned a deep desire, a hope that his ancestors could see him at that moment. A few days earlier, during a meeting with the beautiful professor, the group revealed their intention to film their journey through the tower. To better explain the plan, the protagonist showed a small floating camera robot. However, although she was not against the idea of filming, the professor warned that the rooms constantly changed scenery. Meanwhile, the girl in the group showed great interest in the small robot. Light, after checking the manual, confirmed the professor's words and asked his colleague to take a look at the basic guide. Yumina then explained that the information was correct since each floor of the tower was called a room. She added that when monsters were defeated or a trap was deactivated, the surrounding space changed completely. While listening to the teacher's explanation and sipping a cup of tea, Daka reflected on the dungeons and their traps. At that moment, for the first time during the meeting, she spoke up. She questioned, what would happen if someone were defeated inside the tower? Everyone became alert at the young woman's question. The protagonist widened his eyes, and even Light hadn't considered that possibility. Concern spread among them. The teacher, noticing the tense atmosphere, took a deep breath before responding, stating that the young woman was as sharp as ever. She then explained that even after a fatal attack, challengers would remain alive, which relieved both the protagonist and Light. To be more precise, the teacher clarified that if someone were defeated, they would be automatically transported to the tower's entrance. Still worried, the protagonist wanted to know if, in that case, the person would have to climb the tower again from the beginning. However, the teacher explained that thanks to a special artifact, they could re-enter exactly from the point where they had stopped. Showing a pendant, she stated that the item was rare, as student identification was essential to ensure the ascent in the tower. At that moment, the white-haired young woman interrupted the group's thoughts. She pointed out that the teacher had not been entirely clear. Thus, she directly asked if there were areas within the tower where challengers could truly be eliminated. The teacher realized that the student had several doubts, and for a moment chose to remain silent. She also noticed that the young woman was more defiant than usual. After reflecting, she decided to respond, revealing that indeed some areas were exceptions to that rule. Upon entering the dungeon, the protagonist group encountered several monsters. The enemy they were fighting was a claw scyther, a creature resembling a green slime, but much more threatening. This monster was known for devouring the equipment of those climbing the towers, leaving them defenseless. Light's sword cut to these creatures as if slicing small portions of slime. However, while Light focused on melee combat, Dako fired at the monsters using her energy. The duo was completely immersed in battle, while the protagonist was doing something different. He extended his hand and fixed his gaze on the object in front of him, a simple torch. He attempted to extract the concept of fire, but although he felt its presence, he couldn't absorb it. He was capable of performing extractions even in other dimensions, so he wondered why he couldn't do it here. Lost in his magical thoughts, he was suddenly brought back to reality by Dao, who, irritated, complained that he had gotten distracted. The protagonist explained that he had tried to absorb the flame but failed. Hearing this, Dao commented that it was a pity. He asked her not to underestimate his powers so much. As the two talked, one of the slimy creatures approached, now much larger due to its irritation. The monster was quickly restrained by a chain that held it in place. Daka looked at the protagonist and asked, "Is that how your little snake behaves during battles?" Hooving Eva, who had transformed into a spiked chain, the protagonist confirmed with a slight smile. He then commanded the chain to continue attacking. The snake, in chain form, flew through the dungeon room, striking the green slimes with speed and precision. Seeing the chains dominate the entire floor, View praised the protagonist, admitting that attack was quite effective. He agreed, stating it's efficient but noisy. Another source of noise came from a girl running across the battlefield. Rachel, with sharp teeth and red eyes, charged fiercely at the creatures, tearing them apart with her claws. Her attack was so strong that, upon landing, she sent stone blocks flying in all directions. The white-haired young woman didn't think that running around screaming like that was an efficient tactic. However, both the pink-haired beauty and Light continued to fight in their own ways. After practically defeating all the slimy creatures, Light realized that the first room contained only those monsters. However, Dew had the impression that there was something more. She warned the group not to lower their guard as she felt an energy beginning to concentrate. Hearing her words, Lura grew concerned, asking if an elite monster was about to appear. Light turned to the protagonist, but he was already one step ahead. Before Light could suggest using the all-seeing eyes to find out what was happening, Yoo-won was already observing. Suddenly, he called Rutel's attention and pointed to a large obelisk ahead of them. The object had transformed into a magic circle with a pentagram at its center. The protagonist ordered Rel destroy it immediately. Without hesitation, she lunged forward with her sharp claws, her eyes glowing with intense fury. Her strike was devastating, raising a cloud of dust inside the room and obscuring everyone's vision. Light was the first to regain his sight. Upon seeing the result, he was overwhelmed with emotion. With a single blow, Rutel had destroyed the obelisk before the elite monster could be formed. As a reward, she received the core of the beast that never had the chance to be born. Now holding it in her hands, breathless from the effort, it was then that Light, glancing at her unintentionally, noticed something. What he saw left him practically shaken. Rachel looked different. Before, her hair had been completely light pink. Now it had transformed into strands of various shades. Seeing that the protagonist was staring directly at her, Rutel wanted to know what was going on. He explained that something had changed in her hair and reflected on the concept of the furnace heart, which had manifested. The protagonist wondered which of the two factors had caused this change, as the concept presented had the property of burning emotions. As he pondered what he had witnessed, he felt a hand grip the sleeve of his shirt. The young woman worried and asked, "Have I become frightening during my attack?" However, the protagonist smiled and instead said, in reality, gave off a rather comforting feeling. Despite the kind words she heard, Rutel insisted that the situation could get worse. Annoyed, her friend interrupted the conversation, questioning, "Why are you so worried? I already told you everything is fine." She also stated, "You can relax. If you ever lose control, I'll be the one to put an end to everything." The protagonist was startled by his friend's words and tried to calm her down, saying, "You shouldn't think that way." However, before he could insist, the girl crossed her arms and declared, "It would be better if only you and I climbed the tower." Feeling overwhelmed by so many comments, Rudel became uneasy. To change the situation, the protagonist approached her, assuring her that he would find a solution. Smiling, he stated, "I know exactly why you're feeling this way. It's my duty to help you." The girl's depressed expression immediately changed, her eyes shining with hope. Emotional, she grabbed his hands, sincerely thanking him, which made him blush slightly. After talking a bit about what happened and resolving the situation with the obelisk, a magic circle appeared around them. Moments later, they were transported to the second floor. Upon arrival, Light crouched down and touched the green ground beneath his feet. Unlike the previous room, there was now grass growing around them, giving the environment a completely different atmosphere. The protagonist, attentive, analyzed the concepts contained in the orb his companion had received earlier. He realized that all the time spent running through the dungeon seemed to have been in vain, as in just one room, he had acquired new concepts. Now, he possessed the concepts of acid and fusion, both attributes capable of dissolving materials. He decided then to use the concept of fusion in his sword. While feeding Eva with the concept of acid, the small snake coiled around his arm opened its mouth and swallowed the tiny sphere of energy containing acid. While the protagonist and DLA were talking, Light became alert. The environment around them was suddenly changing. Since the monsters of the second room were about to appear, Light tried to ask the duo to stop chatting. However, a laser suddenly passed right by his shoulder. The shot hit a monster emerging ahead. Dao responded to Light's request to take things more seriously. "The second room isn't much different from the first," she said, "and the monster that appeared there is nothing more than a weak evil spirit." With a teasing tone, she asked, "Do you think an ant could defeat a lion?" Light grumbled, annoyed by her attitude. That was when the young woman suggested that the protagonist handle the entire fight in the second room alone. The protagonist was confused, not understanding why the entire responsibility for combat was being placed on him. When he questioned the idea, the others agreed that it could be very dangerous. However, with a smile on her face, Yu contradicted them all, claiming that her suggestion was brilliant. She explained that he needed to develop his skills quickly, especially since greater challenges were approaching. So she asked again, "Isn't my idea actually valid?" The protagonist then smiled, as he always did before a battle. He stretched and stepped forward in front of the group. Light tried to convince him it could be dangerous. The protagonist interrupted him. "It's fine," he stated. "You've already said this is necessary. Besides, I know I need to grow stronger quickly." While stretching his hands, he asked, "Could the two of you help me if necessary?" Seeing that there was no way to make him change his mind, Rutel decided to cooperate. Facing the various demonic spirits, the protagonist smiled, satisfied with the support of his friends. Then he called Du, and looking at her asked, "Will you help me later in case I need to conserve energy?" The young woman smiled, her expression proud, and promised, "I won't let you perish." After the brief dialogue, the protagonist summoned Eva, drawing a magic circle above her. As she passed through the circle, Eva transformed into a massive firearm. The protagonist's command, she began firing at the demonic spirit. The monsters screamed as they were annihilated, some even dissolving into small rabbits. Rachel and Light watched the scene, both impressed and somewhat startled. The blonde young man wondered if that was a typical weapon from the protagonist's world. He didn't know exactly what kind of armament it was, but he could see how quickly the enemies were being defeated. Because of this, he furrowed his brows and deep down wished that the soldiers of his country could have access to weapons like that. Observing carefully, the white-haired young woman was also impressed by the power of the weapon Eva had become. However, she quickly realized a major disadvantage of that type of armament. The attacks were inconsistent and only worked well in long-range combat. In enclosed spaces or melee battles, the weapon would be practically useless. There, where space was limited, this posed a problem. As if to confirm her analysis, one of the ghosts silently slid behind the protagonist, preparing a sneak attack. The malicious spirit opened its enormous mouth, larger than the protagonist himself, ready to swallow him whole. Seeing the scene, Light and Rutel instantly became worried. The protagonist, noticing his friend's reactions, decided to turn around, and came face to face with the enormous mouth of the evil spirit. Ignoring his friend's concerns, the protagonist materialized a sword as he faced the malicious spirit. With a precise vertical slash, he defeated the monster that had attempted to attack him. His two companions, who had been on edge, were finally able to breathe in relief. However, Light was surprised to see the protagonist holding a sword. After all, he had strengthened his own Longsword with various attributes, preparing it for when he truly needed to use it. Meanwhile, the pink-haired girl had no idea that the protagonist was a swordsman. However, he explained that it wasn't quite like that. He said he was still far from being as skilled as Light or Dako. Hearing this, the young woman smiled, finding his humility well placed. She was proud of how much he had improved up to that point. But the protagonist didn't stop there. He continued advancing, alternating between shots from his weapon and sword strikes. That way, he destroyed numerous evil spirits that emerged in his path. They kept appearing, only to be struck down and defeated one by one. Now, besides using Eva, he was also wielding his sword with ease. Every movement showcased the skills he had acquired so far. Smiling, the protagonist commented, "Although I'm not the best, I'm trying to improve with every battle." After defeating most of the evil spirits, he rested his sword on the ground and took a deep breath. He looked at the others and stated, "There are no more demonic spirits ahead. Only one remains, the last one." Thinking about this, he summoned Eva and transformed her into a chain. He ordered her to bind that last evil spirit. Then he said, "We can rest a little before eliminating it." As they reflected and caught their breath, the white-haired young woman crouched down to touch the remains of the defeated spirits. That was when she noticed something interesting. The edge of the protagonist's sword had melted and disintegrated the monsters. With that, she concluded that he was already using the abilities he had obtained in the previous room. This detail made her reflect on the recent events. Light, too, couldn't hide his surprise at the realization. She, on the other hand, showered the protagonist with praise, stating, "Your last attack was excellent." She began thinking aloud, commenting I should focus more on my movements. Even so, she acknowledged that her style was better than simply swinging a sword without strategy. Light, however, became irritated and asked, "Why do you treat me as if I were Knave?" Meanwhile, the protagonist reached into his inventory and pulled out a cold can of energy drink. He opened it and began drinking calmly, laughing at the dude's argument. Seeing this, his three companions stared at him with threatening expressions. They were all furious, demanding to know what he was drinking. Some even wanted to try a bit. He pointed to the can and said, "I don't have any more." He also mentioned that the type of drink could be purchased outside. However, no one bought that excuse. Unlike him, the others couldn't simply step outside. Upset, he put the can back into his inventory, saying he would only use it when he was truly exhausted. His last comment caught the attention of the white-haired girl. Because of that, she decided to take the lead of the group at that moment. Noticing that everyone had rested enough, the protagonist hurried to defeat the last monster. At that very moment, a new magic circle appeared beneath each of their feet. As they were transported to the next room, the protagonist closed his eyes. He wanted to have an internal view of his own attributes. That was when a window appeared in his mind, displaying more than 10 attributes distributed among different categories. He felt excited. With that number of attributes, he could be considered at an intermediate level within the academy. However, he realized that to increase his efficiency, he should focus more on strengthening his swordsman attribute. The situation seemed to depend on how much he could improve his martial arts. After all, the difference between his strength and the Erector's was approximately 200 points. The protagonist concluded that there was no way to close that gap in just one weekend. However, since he was learning martial arts from the skilled young woman, he thought that perhaps he had found a path to follow. He knew that acquiring skills was important, but he also understood that nurturing those skills was even more essential. Reflecting on his martial arts growth, he considered asking his companion to teach him a little more. But soon after, he dismissed the thought, feeling it wouldn't be fair to burden her. As he tried to find ways to become stronger, several gusts of wind rushed toward him. The problem was that he was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't even notice what was happening. For a moment, he still thought he was simply crossing into the next room. Then a voice started calling him insistently. Someone was shouting his name. It was Light. A young man was falling. Suddenly, the protagonist opened his eyes and realized the situation they were in. All four of them were falling. The wind whirred fiercely around them. Faced with that scene, the protagonist momentarily panicked. Looking down, he tried to understand why he was falling from the sky. Rel seemed even more distressed. She struggled against gravity, holding her skirt down so the wind would lift it. The protagonist looked down again. Once more, he questioned what was happening, but this time, he noticed something that made his heart race. Below them, sharp spears were pointing straight up. Thinking quickly, the protagonist summoned Eva. In an instant, she transformed into a chain. With precise movement, the chain wrapped around Rutel's body, saving her from falling onto the deadly spears just in time. When he saw that his technique had worked, he let out a sigh of relief. Even so, he still held the chain tightly. However, there was another trap right at the transition point. As he tried to grasp the situation, he heard someone calling his name. Looking back, he saw the young woman hanging, being upside down. She had an obvious suggestion. He needed to move quickly. But instead of acting, he was momentarily surprised by the sight of the young woman stuck to the ceiling, upside down. Just as she finished warning him, he heard a loud noise. One of the walls opened, launching several spears in his direction. He was startled and had to think fast. He couldn't let go of the girl he was holding with the chain. Without hesitation, he quickly pulled the chain. With that motion, she was flung upward. At the same time, the protagonist had the idea to summon Lilith while also directing Eva. The young woman screamed in fear. As she was abruptly pulled upward, she needed to be thrown in a precise angle so that the spears would miss her. The protagonist's quick movement caused the spears to collide with each other. When the young woman began falling again, he was there to catch her in his arms. As this happened, the girl blushed slightly. He was very close when he asked if she was okay. Now they were riding a glider bike. Calmly, he apologized for the abrupt pull earlier. He explained that he had no choice since the situation was complicated. As he spoke, more traps were activating around them. He simply smiled. With agility, he performed several sword strikes to deflect them. The axes. Before they could get too close, they were destroyed. It was clear that Light looked different. Behind his back, there were two pairs of wings resembling those of a dragon. With a divine sword in hand, he walked among the destroyed axes, wondering what was going on. That was when he remembered the meeting with the professor. She had said that the traps wouldn't appear until room 20. However, they were only in room 3, and the difficulty had already escalated to this level. Beating his wings to stay airborne, Light saw a floating bike moving through the room. He wondered when his companion had gotten that item. Meanwhile, the protagonist riding the floating motorcycle was frustrated. He accelerated at full speed, dodging the traps that appeared every moment. Behind him, seated on the motorcycle, was his companion. Rudel still remembered how the protagonist had held her moments before. Now smiling, she hugged his back, already comfortable with the situation. The protagonist, surprised by the sudden embrace, got distracted. Because of this lapse, an arrow struck the flying motorcycle. He zigzagged between the columns, scattered throughout the room, trying to dodge the weapons being launched at them. The D was getting closer and closer to the floating motorcycle. Suddenly, a leg strike blocked some of the spears. A protagonist stopped the motorcycle. Looking to the side, he saw Light floating. He wanted to know what Light was doing there, just running and watching. Looking at Light's appearance, the protagonist was surprised by his wings. He asked, "What's that?" However, the blonde also had a question. Pointing at the flying motorcycle, he asked, "Where did that come from?" According to him, that item seemed to belong to Yoo-won's world. The protagonist then asked, "Where is the girl?" He thought she might have fallen into a trap. However, the situation was different from what he had imagined. She was moving skillfully along the tower walls. The protagonist didn't know exactly where she was, but he trusted that she would never fall into a trap so easily. The skilled young woman dodged the spears like a professional. Always with quick and precise movements, as he suspected, she kept her eyes sharp on everything happening around her. Now, no longer worried about his safety, Light asked the protagonist, "What should we do?" He remembered the manual. According to the instructions, they should. The protagonist asked Light to run to the other side of the room. That way, he would have time to analyze the traps. While Light flew to the other side of the room, the protagonist observed the attack patterns. Surprisingly, all the traps were targeting a single person. It was Light. Because of this, the protagonist realized that the traps might prioritize those who moved. He remembered the initial situation with his companion. With that, he finally understood what they needed to do. They had to avoid moving carelessly in that trap-filled room. The protagonist placed his hands on his head, frustrated for not realizing this sooner. Meanwhile, his companion tried to warn him about another arrow coming in his direction. "The arrow's coming," his companion shouted. The arrow hit the floating motorcycle. Annoyed, the protagonist pulled the arrow out and held it angrily. "We need to stop moving recklessly," he muttered under his breath. He needed to warn the others to stop moving recklessly. But if they stopped, how would they clear the room? Gripping the arrow more tightly, he finally noticed something. There was a reaction happening in it. Looking closely, he saw that the arrow was being absorbed. This was different. Since the first room, he had tried to absorb concepts, but nothing had worked. He had always sought to understand why. Now he looked at his sword. He wondered if his guess was just a coincidence, but he wouldn't know if he didn't try. So he decided to grab the sword. His companion, not understanding, became curious to see what he was doing. Before her eyes, he began absorbing the sword as well. Both of them were surprised. After the sword disappeared from the protagonist's hand, turning into nothing but golden dust, he received a concept, though not the one he expected. Instead, he obtained the concept of cutting, which made him remember what had happened with the thrusting technique his companion had been teaching him. While he was thinking about this, Rutel asked him to look in a certain direction. When he did, he saw that Light was surfing on a wave. After being thrown off the wave, annoyed, Light leaned on his sword. Everything had happened because he had let his guard down. Thinking that only the weapons were dangerous, he hadn't expected to fall into that trap. After falling, Light's vision started to darken. Meanwhile, he realized that faced with dozens of new traps, he would hardly be able to defend himself. At that moment, the protagonist didn't hesitate. He was on Lilith, his hover bike, and had to leave Rel. Then he quickly set off toward Light. Rutel only watched as her companion sped away, but he had already apologized to her earlier. However, she understood that he didn't want her getting involved in this either. As the protagonist moved across the waves that struck his companion, he gained more points in his water-related concepts. Thus, everything happened as he expected, and just like before, what had touched the protagonist was water, but he had received the concept of waves. Finally, he managed to understand his power and realized why he hadn't received the concept of the sword earlier. As he advanced on the floating bike, he jumped from pillar to pillar, moving quickly to analyze the situation. She was surprised when she looked down and saw the protagonist riding a floating bike with waves of energy being launched to the sides. However, he was heading toward Light, having realized that the state of the substance at the moment it manifested determined the concept he would acquire. Just like the traps that had once aimed at his neck, he had obtained a beheading concept. Now with that in mind, he sought to move forward, seeing arrows and spears being activated by the trap. All those weapons were falling toward Light as he approached. He shouted, warning Light that he would take care of the situation. Thus, he completed his advance with the bike. At that moment, he expected the ability of the all-seeing eye to deepen a little more. The arrows got closer and closer to Light, who was shouting for help from the protagonist. He closed his eyes, stretched out his hands, and aimed at the weapons. At that moment, he tried to use his power. When he opened his eyes, he activated the ability, and at the tip of each blade, a concept appeared, something he could now understand. Now the intention behind each weapon was revealed, and they were all coming toward him. He had drawn all their focus onto himself. The blonde boy with blue eyes was incredulous at what had happened. He was safe. However, now the protagonist was the perfect target, the target for all those weapons, holding one in his hand since he had no intention of picking them up one by one. He didn't want the possibility of them mixing and losing their individual essence. With that, by unleashing an extreme burst of energy, he managed to link the concept in his hand to the other concepts of the weapons. When he completed this power, a golden light shone and surrounded the protagonist. He was quite satisfied with the plan to infuse the concepts as it had been successful. On the other side of the room, the pink-haired young woman watched everything. The remnants of the golden glow made the scene even more beautiful. Calmly, she stretched out her hands so that the golden light from the destroyed weapons would land on them. With a slight smile, it was clear that she was pleased with Yoo-won's progress. He had finally stopped his bike, parking it a few meters from Light. Seeing that everything was settling down, the young man ran toward him. However, the protagonist was satisfied to see that his friend was also unharmed. Light looked at the protagonist in surprise, noticing what he was holding in his hand. The blonde young man wanted to know what it was, but the protagonist admitted he didn't know. He explained that it had appeared when he had gathered all the weapons. While the two were talking, a new trap was activated. They immediately went on high alert. However, to their relief, the two girls appeared, and with incredible synchronized movements, they managed to deflect the swords with their strikes. Thus, they prevented anything bad from happening to them. Rutel sighed in relief. Meanwhile, the white-haired young woman took the opportunity to scold the two once again. The protagonist was so excited by the girl's performance that he didn't even mind. Meanwhile, Light wasn't pleased at all. With the last trap under control, the force spheres reappeared, triggering a room transition. As they were transported, the protagonist watched the duo argue again. While Light complained, the young woman acted as if she had heroically arrived at the last minute. Just to show off, the protagonist felt inspired. Even though the two were always bickering, he knew they would always save each other. Regarding Light's complaint, Deco stated that she had waited until the last moment to arrive and surprise everyone. After Dell's remark, they were transported to the next room, moving on to the fourth. Now in this room, the protagonist was able to take a good look at the monsters. With all four of them together, the protagonist commented that at least this time they wouldn't be attacked from above. With that, he was able to attack the monsters before they attacked him. He soon understood that these creatures were giant spiders. Looking at the creature before him, he wasn't quite sure what it was or what its power might be. Light told him that this was a unique monster, a tower spider, and that it could appear anywhere. With that, Light drew his sword, intending to take the lead to protect his friend. Even after Yoo-won's attacks, the spiders had not suffered any damage. After receiving orders from Light, the white-haired young woman showed her indignation. The protagonist was also not satisfied, as he had been unable to be useful this time. The young woman noticed that he was in disbelief at how strong the monsters had already become. Dew stepped in front of everyone, asking them to take a step back. Looking at the protagonist, she said, "Carefully observe my next movements." After concentrating energy into her hands, it formed into an attack like an energy cannon. With a powerful strike, the young woman quickly reached a large number of spiders. The explosion of energy left the protagonist astonished. He realized her attack was much stronger than Ava's bullets. At that moment, she instructed everyone to let the protagonist land a final attack. Looking at him, she smiled and said, "You're a phenomenal teacher." The protagonist, looking back at her, gave a slightly awkward smile. Quickly, he drew his sword and asked Light to cover his back. Then he charged forward to face the spiders, reflecting as he moved. As he thought, the spiders approached him calmly. Getting close enough, he could see their similar patterns. Without hesitation, he attacked one of the spiders with his sword, grateful for the opportunity to deliver the final blow. However, both Light and Rutel, who were watching the protagonist, looked very concerned. They had good reason to be. When he struck with his sword, he failed to land the blow and simply felt his hands tremble. Seeing that his attack had no effect, he tried applying more force, but the spider's shell was too thick. After the protagonist's failed attack, it was the spider's turn. It locked its glowing eyes on him. In the next instant, it leaped at him, attempting a swift strike. Sensing the danger, he jumped back, barely escaping the ambush. However, he couldn't give up and advanced again. This time, he remembered to use a thrusting technique. At the very least, he managed to strike the spider's head. But still, it wasn't enough to defeat it. His companions were excited to see him making some progress. Even though he had a small success, the protagonist knew he couldn't continue with such a mediocre attack. Already showing signs of frustration, he clenched his teeth, the thought that the tower spiders were too much for him gnawing at his mind. Then something surfaced in his mind, an idea he should have remembered earlier. He had absorbed several concepts in the previous room and still hadn't used them. He realized this might be the perfect moment. With a flash of insight, he infused one of the concepts into his sword. As soon as the blade received the concept, it began to release small sparks. With a simple swing, it emanated a powerful aura. That was when he decided to test if this concept would work against his current enemies. The spiders. The sword moved swiftly, following the protagonist's motion, slicing through the spider with ease. It was an incredible feeling when he finally managed to land a successful hit. Light was astonished at the protagonist's instant improvement in just a few moments. Even Doko was surprised, though she remained silent, not wanting to make it public. After the attack, the protagonist felt that he had made a clean cut, but something felt strange. He started wondering if he had swung the sword with more force than necessary, so he tried again. Seeing the protagonist's determination, Light moved forward to assist him. While the pink-haired girl followed as well, she carefully observed the protagonist and realized that he had done something to his sword in just a brief moment. It was something strong enough to allow him to cut through the spiders with ease. Now she continued watching the protagonist's movements as he kept slicing through the spiders naturally. She noticed that little by little he was trying to improve his skills. She also knew that normally when someone strengthened their sword, they ended up swinging aimlessly. And as she observed him, Light and Rutel continued eliminating as many spiders as possible. Doko knew that up until now, the protagonist had not shown even a hint of that common flaw. She hoped that even if it wasn't quick, one day he would understand for himself the true essence of what a cut really is. Seeing him so engaged, she couldn't help but remember her own story. After overcoming the 3 calamities, she was proudly called the greatest prodigy of the martial world. And now, she realized she was watching someone just as talented as she was. This person made even her own talents seem small. Unaware of her thoughts, the protagonist continued swinging his sword, attacking the tower spiders. As he kept fighting against the spiders, even without knowing his friend's thoughts, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Light, noticing his friend looking around in all directions as if searching for something, asked, "What's wrong?" At one point, the protagonist's gaze met hers. Upon seeing him holding the drinks, she ran after him. Meanwhile, Light received an external message, and the same happened to the other 3. All 4 of them had received the same message. 3 of them gathered to talk about it. But someone noticed something unusual. The blonde boy with blue eyes was the first to open the message, which told them to leave the tower. The protagonist didn't understand why they were suddenly being told to leave, but they saw that the message was from the director. While Rachel noticed that something was bothering Dello, she herself didn't seem to have realized anything. But the moment of peace was broken when Rutel shouted to alert the others that the enemy was coming. The protagonist was the first to look at the girl, and then all the others turned and were startled. They saw that 2 large portals had opened, with hundreds of spiders pouring out of them. Now they finally understood why they had been told to leave the tower immediately. After the 2 portals appeared, more cracks began to form. When they checked their student identification devices, they realized there was no signal. With the notifications no longer working, the group was completely trapped inside the tower's room. Light, preparing himself, gripped his sword tightly. They knew that this was the exact situation the professor had warned them about, one that could eliminate them for good. The numerous portals completely filled the tower's room, with spiders covering the ground, walls, and ceiling. They advanced rapidly, leaving no room for escape. Rutel was the first to charge forward for it. Followed closely by Light, who wielded his sword, the protagonist was terrified. Faced with so many spiders, he had never encountered anything this dangerous before. He remembered that during the meeting, Yumina had revealed the high probability of dimensional pirates invading the tower. At the time, since the protagonist didn't know what dimensional pirates were, the professor had said she would explain later. For now, she needed to focus on the main problem, the abnormalities caused by unusual invasions. She explained that areas once considered safe zones could suddenly turn hostile as the number of monsters multiplied. The difficulty level could increase unpredictably, and many other problems could arise simultaneously. The more the professor explained, the more frightened they became. After explaining everything, she told them to remember that the tower did not guarantee their safety. Now, they were trapped in exactly the kind of situation the professor had warned them about. The protagonist group had to find a way to survive. Just then, an explosion blasted through a wall, opening another passage. Riding his floating bike, the protagonist carried Rutel, while the others rushed toward a more open area. They saw the spiders starting to pour through the new opening. Light was growing more frustrated with the seemingly endless wave of creatures. Rachel bared her teeth in anger as she watched the spiders swarming from the adjacent room. Slowly, the glow in the spiders' eyes grew more intense. As they approached the passage the group of students had used to escape, they moved in an organized manner, flooding into the room. Seeing so many enemies, the white-haired young woman commented, "They seem endless." And then she struck again. Using an energy burst, she targeted a cluster of spiders and fired. Her successful attack wiped out many of the creatures. Seeing her determination, Light also decided to join the battle, swinging his sword. Their combined assault was taking down multiple spiders at once. The protagonist observed the intense battle. Two must have already defeated dozens of spiders, and Light wasn't falling behind in terms of attacks. Both were already showing signs of exhaustion. Then there was Rutel, who, after using so much of her power, had most of her hair darkened. The young woman barely spoke. She only growled, driven by the urge to eliminate all the spiders. The protagonist knew that if this continued and her hair turned completely dark, it would be a bad scenario. Noticing the protagonist's concern, she stopped attacking and joined him. She started commenting on Rutel's situation. At that moment, she stated that she wouldn't be able to go much further without taking a break. Hearing the young woman say she was getting exhausted quickly, the protagonist didn't hesitate. He pulled an energy drink from his inventory and told her that he would hold off the spiders while she could drink in peace. And that's exactly what she did. She took the drink from the protagonist's hand. With a cane in her hand, she smiled and asked, "Do you really believe you can handle the situation on your own?" Affirming that he could, he suddenly pulled out a grenade, showing that he was well prepared for the fight. He quickly pulled the pin and got ready to throw it. "Watch closely," he said. Then he hurled the grenade, which flew rapidly above the spiders. As the grenade remained in the air, Rutel took notice of its presence and watched attentively. Suddenly, a strange power enveloped the grenade, and while still midair, it exploded. The explosion created a wave of fire, completely engulfing most of the spiders in the area. The massive blast sent out a wave of heat. Forcing Light to step back, he shielded himself with his sword. As he protected himself, he saw the protagonist pass by and asked, "What kind of power is that?" Passing by on his flying motorcycle, the protagonist replied, "I put a lot of effort into that weapon." Now pushing forward, he told Light, "Take a break." He realized that his companion probably still had a lot of energy, but he also knew he couldn't rely entirely on her power. He kept advancing, unsure of how long the spiders would continue appearing. He knew that if he could defeat as many spiders as possible, he would buy time for his friends. After unsheathing his sword, the protagonist suddenly received a notification. The blood poison in his blade had increased to 15. He was surprised by the rapid growth, and to his astonishment, his cutting concept had also increased to level 2. As he rode his floating bike, he glanced at the sword in his hand and noticed it was turning red. Although he didn't know exactly what the blood poison was based on, he kept advancing, knowing he would discover the answer soon enough. When he used that sword against the spiders swinging it, a large amount of energy was unleashed along with the cut. Something surprising happened. The trajectory of the blades seemed to change as if they had grown stronger. As he fought the spiders, he noticed that the cutting concept was increasing the sword's power, and the blood poison was extending the reach of his attacks. However, for that to happen, the sword needed to absorb his own blood. The protagonist felt uneasy with the weapon, realizing he wouldn't be able to use it frequently. As Light approached, he admitted that he was once again impressed by what the protagonist had shown. Seeing Light and Du approaching, the protagonist asked, "Where is Rachel?" The two explained that she was likely still eliminating spiders. The protagonist wanted to insist that Light and the white-haired girl take a break, but they had already rested enough. As they prepared to switch positions with the protagonist, Light noticed that the number of spiders had decreased. Hearing Light mention this, the protagonist and the young woman turned their gaze toward the passage leading to the next room. They saw that the number of monsters was dwindling, meaning the battle was either nearing its end or something much stronger was coming. As the three of them discussed this, the young woman felt exactly what they were talking about. An eerie energy made her growl. She stopped in front of a specific spot and noticed that a portal larger than the previous ones had begun forming in the room. That was when the elite boss of the tower spiders began emerging from the new opening. The protagonist was shocked upon seeing the enormous spider, many times larger than any of the others. While the protagonist was still processing the young woman's words, Light was shouting for his attention. Should there be more than one elite monster? Light asked, and it caught the protagonist's attention. He turned to look, and that's when he understood why Light was so frantic. There wasn't just one monster, there were two. Looking at this second giant spider, Yoo-won realized this was the worst-case scenario. Now they were completely surrounded by two of those monsters. They were trapped. Light became extremely nervous, questioning what was happening. While he panicked, the young woman continued sipping her drink. Unlike the others, Ruto was growing increasingly agitated. Baring her fangs, her fury was visible in her eyes as she lunged at one of the spiders. She rushed straight toward one of the giant spiders, attacking recklessly. Light was worried, but the protagonist commented that maybe this was a good thing. Now they were moving in sync, naturally supporting each other. They agreed to split up and attack the spiders at the same time. The protagonist chose to take on one of the spiders with Dew. After hearing the full plan, Light agreed with him and prepared to work with Rutel on the opposite side. Standing face to face with the giant spiders, Yoo-won raised his sword in front of him. The confidence they had when deciding to split up seemed to waver as he faced such a massive creature. Noticing his hesitation, the white-haired young woman calmly took a sip of her drink while observing. Once she finished, she walked over to the protagonist. Leaning close to his ear, she reminded him, "You said you deal with the spiders easily with me by your side." Then she stepped back, tossing the empty cup toward him. After making a remark about the drink, she summoned her sword to join the fight. Placing herself in front to take the lead, she declared, now they'll pay the price for their boldness. Facing the giant spider, she drew her sword. The protagonist glanced at her weapon in surprise, wondering why she had unsheathed it. She was clearly showing her technique to him, and she noticed his curious gaze fixed on her. She met his eyes with a sharp stare. Annoyed, she said, "I simply don't want to dirty my hands," and told him not to get any wrong ideas. Dew's words were entirely truthful. After watching him for so long and analyzing what he had learned, she knew he was still missing one crucial movement. She was determined to show it to him in this one opportunity. Then, a powerful energy surrounded her as she prepared to attack. She wanted the protagonist to pay close attention. At that moment, the young woman's eyes shone in a deep blue hue, the same color as her energy. As she moved, stretching her arm for the attack, it was only for a brief moment. But in that moment, the protagonist lost focus. The reason was simple. Rel had lost control. Instead of attacking the spider, she started attacking Light. He tried to defend himself by raising his sword, but the problem was that the girl was in a furious state. She didn't even notice that the elite spider was advancing. Because of that, the spider leaped and launched a jet of web to attack them both. Light was caught off guard by the web coming toward him. It was about to trap both him and Rutel. Thinking quickly, he threw the young woman away so she wouldn't be caught in the spider's web. As a result, he was left alone, wrapped in the spider's trap, while the girl landed safely on top of a pillar. She stared at the spider, growling, while Light was still tangled in the webs. The giant spider roared at the girl, and in her beast-like state, she roared back. Looking at everything happening around him, it was impossible for the protagonist to maintain full concentration. Noticing his lack of focus, Dew asked, "What are you looking at?" She made it clear that he should only be looking at her. He replied, "I'm looking, but I'm not fully focused." At that moment, he revealed his concerns. She moved her sword, observing her own movements carefully as energy surrounded her. As Dew assured him that everything was fine, the spider in front of her fell split cleanly in half. The strike that Doko had executed was a simple movement, coming from below and cutting upward. However, with that one move, the protagonist witnessed something astonishing, the immense gap in skill between them. After the young woman's slash, the spider collapsed, its severed parts scattering in opposite directions. As he observed that movement, the protagonist suddenly began receiving multiple notifications. Concepts acquired, so many that he started to feel a slight headache. He had just understood advanced techniques. Many of his other concepts also leveled up as he absorbed complex martial arts knowledge. The power he had just witnessed was similar to the moment he had seen the force field in Wema. Trembling from the intense headache, Benny wondered how someone could infuse so much willpower into their sword. The deadly concept he had just discovered felt so vivid that it sent chills down his spine. With all of this, his vision became blurry. The girl who had been calling his name repeatedly suddenly approached him. She asked, "Did you carefully observe my strike?" When he complained that she was getting too close, she suddenly tossed a violet-colored spear to him. Now holding the spear in his hand and looking at it carefully, he noticed it was overflowing with energy. He felt happy, but also questioned whether he should really keep it since it was the girl who had earned it. Smiling, she told him, "It's your reward. Don't hesitate, just accept the gift." From a distance, Light, seeing the two of them chatting so casually, became furious. He shouted at them, "Stop fooling around and help me quickly." He had been trapped in the spiderwebs for a while and was extremely concerned. The young woman who had defeated the spider alone was now entering a berserk state, consumed by uncontrollable rage. The protagonist looked at the young woman, startled. Seeing the situation Light was in, Yu said that he was completely useless. The protagonist knew that if they advanced recklessly, they would be defeated in just a second by the rampaging girl. Looking back, he stated that the only person who could handle the situation was the one who had defeated the other spider. Hugh seemed pleased about having to solve all the group's problems. Meanwhile, the completely out-of-control young woman began looking at the others. Yoo-won tried to reason with her, asking for her help since this was an unusual situation. Being persistent in presenting a reasonable argument, she couldn't refuse, but she noticed something. And with that, she decided to move, starting a stretch. Seeing this, the protagonist got excited. Looking at the girl, she stated that she would keep the beast entertained. But in return, the protagonist had to defeat the other spider. As the two conversed, Dew interrupted and charged at Rutel. After attacking her, she even decided to provoke her with hostile words. Trying to draw her in more and more, Dao claimed that she could have real fun with this wild girl. The more she provoked the young woman, the deeper she fell into her uncontrollable fury. At the very least, the young woman got what she wanted. Rutel lunged at her, her claws flashing as she leaped off the spider. She effortlessly dodged Rutel's first attack and jumped back, continuing her insults. With each strike from Rutel's claws, she executed simple movements to evade them. After several attacks, Rutel had not managed to land even a single scratch on the young woman's white hair. But now that she had positioned herself exactly where she wanted, Deiko grabbed the young woman's wrist and threw her to the ground. With that impact, a bit of reason returned to Rutel's mind. However, it still wasn't enough to completely wake her up. Seeing this, Dao released her and threw out a few more provocations. She told Rutel that attacking blindly against someone stronger was foolish. She ordered her to get up, saying she still had plenty of energy. Dao claimed that she would keep her entertained just long enough to bring her back to her senses. Hearing the young woman growling, the protagonist observed the fight between the two. Seeing the protagonist distracted, Doko scolded him, prompting him to materialize his sword to fight the spider. Even in front of that massive creature, Doko believed that the protagonist could win if only he had been paying closer attention. Seeing how much the young woman expected from him, he asked, "What makes you believe in me so much?" At that moment, one of the spider's massive legs slammed into the ground right next to the protagonist. He barely managed to dodge, leaping to the side as Light, watching from afar, saw him almost get hit. Despite the spider being in a very weakened state, it seemed to completely disregard his strength. Seeing that even a mere spider was looking down on him, he gritted his teeth in frustration. Knowing what he needed to do to fight back, he summoned Eva. This time, not only did the chain appear, but various magical symbols emerged as well. With that, the chains wrapped around large portions of the spider, which thrashed in frustration as it was restrained. Light was astonished to see that the protagonist had managed to trap parts of the spider. Meanwhile, Doko glanced back for a moment, momentarily diverting her attention from her own fight, but the protagonist had to advance with his sword against the bound spider. Though not all of its legs were restrained, some that were still free lashed out at him. He dodged repeatedly, relying on Eva's health to hold most of the legs in place, along with the power of the cutting concept and blood poison in his sword. He was finally ready to attack. He closed the distance with the spider, ensuring that his strike would land properly. The spider sensed the impending danger, and the boy, his eyes burning with rage, slashed at the giant creature. His blade struck the spider, but it wasn't strong enough to finish it off. Watching the protagonist attack, Light remained skeptical, wondering why his blow hadn't been effective. Effortlessly dodging Rutel, Dakado observed Yoo-won with her sharp eyes. The protagonist stepped back a few meters after his first attack failed, questioning why his strike had been so weak. Looking at his sword, he finally realized that the blood poison hadn't activated properly. At that moment, the spider, still bound by the chains, started breaking free. As he processed this, he understood why one of his abilities had failed. After the spider shattered all the chains, it was ready to strike back at the protagonist without hesitation. It launched an attack with its massive legs. A strike that could end his battle in an instant. Watching as the giant spider shattered the chains and prepared to strike the protagonist, Doko froze, leaving an opening for an attack. As dust filled the room, everyone could see the spider lying on the ground while the young man held his sword. The sword and the protagonist's hand dropped to the floor as he also collapsed, exhausted. Overcome by mental fatigue, he recalled what had just happened. The moment his sword and the spider's leg clashed, he had adjusted the angle of his attack. He trembled as he retrieved his sword, knowing that if he had taken the blow head-on, both his sword and himself could have been severely damaged. That's why he questioned how he had been able to perceive it. For a moment, it felt like a fraction of a second had stretched into an eternity. He wondered how the situation had developed like that. Because he had observed Doo's swordsmanship so closely, a sudden notification appeared before him. It was for successfully dodging the enemy's attack. He had mastered the concept of flow. Understanding what had happened made the protagonist push himself harder, silently praising his friend. Now standing again, he approached the spider once more. He realized he couldn't perfectly replicate his friend's swordsmanship. He understood what he needed to improve, so he drew the spider's attention, his sword already in hand. Staring down the spider, he challenged it, feeling its hostility. The creature lifted its legs once again to try to strike him, but this time he continuously swung his sword, defending and dodging the spider's attacks. As he watched the protagonist's actions, Light recalled a concept in fencing called parrying. That concept involved deflecting or redirecting enemy attacks to the side, he thought. It allows a swordsman to break the opponent's momentum or even avoid critical blows. And if the concept was applied correctly, it could reveal an opening in the opponent's defense. However, Light knew that was merely a tactical concept. The reality was very different. He also knew that things didn't usually happen that way. Yet his companion seemed to be going in the opposite direction. Despite being in a situation where it was obvious he had little experience, he was already demonstrating impressive skill. Observing how the protagonist used his ability to dodge attacks, Light wondered, had he really never wielded a sword before? After deflecting another of the spider's attacks, the protagonist finally found the opening he was searching for. Using the concept of deflection to avoid being struck from the front, he rotated his sword into another position in his hand to deflect an attack from the side. He continued evading while pressing forward. Little by little, he began to see things more clearly. Now he knew how to advance and how to gain superiority in the fight. But there was another battle still raging, the one between the girls. Rel, charging forward with her claws, tried to strike the white-haired girl. Her fury was intense, but at one moment she was disarmed, stumbling over Doo's feet. Doo calmly tricked her while remaining standing, watching the protagonist battle. She found what was happening almost unbelievable. She had thought the protagonist would gain something by witnessing her first sword technique. But instead, he was the one showing her something new. That's when she remembered there was a martial art that used flow as its core principle. However, very few people dared to use it because reflecting an opponent's strength required capturing only a brief moment. It was something so difficult that it felt like a 1 in a 100,000 technique. Yet she was watching the protagonist execute it more and more. Now the spider was the one being pressured as its attacks no longer landed. The white-haired young woman knew that using such a technique continuously was extremely risky and required immense effort. That was why most people sought easier techniques like Light had. However, she had always wanted to master martial arts until this moment. Now, she felt as though he was offering her that very opportunity. Standing before the giant spider, the protagonist was showing her that this concept could be far deeper than she had imagined. While Doko was captivated by the fight, Rutel stood up again. In the meantime, regaining a bit of her reason, she relieved a few flicks to the forehead. While Light pleaded to be freed from the webs, Doo had no interest in talking to either of them. She just wanted to keep watching the fight. She realized that merely reflecting the spider's attacks wouldn't be enough for him to end the battle. At one point, gritting his teeth, the protagonist charged at the spider. Even as one of its legs threatened him, he didn't stop moving forward. Doko watched as the protagonist used the enemy's force against itself, spinning. As he advanced, he combined two abilities seamlessly. The young woman saw how in that moment, right before her eyes, with his sword spinning in a horizontal upward motion, he managed to cut through the giant spider. His strike was perfect, landing a direct hit on the spider, which let out a piercing shriek. Watching the scene, Light was left speechless, unable to believe what was happening before his eyes. Meanwhile, the white-haired young woman, slightly flushed, was overcome with excitement as she witnessed the protagonist's success. He had overcome that arduous battle and now simply watched as the giant spider collapsed. Defeated, the giant spider fell to the ground. Ban Yoo-won also collapsed, overwhelmed by stress and exhaustion. As the protagonist sighed, a few notifications began to arrive. Things like external and internal concepts were temporarily synthesized. As he stabilized his breathing, he noticed significant changes happening within his internal code. At that moment, he heard Light calling for him. When he turned around, he saw that Light was trapped in spider webs. But at the same time, Dako was also asking for his help in dealing with a wild and uncontrollable beast. The protagonist felt that everyone was relying on him too much, especially when he had barely managed to defeat the elite enemy. Light, feeling frustrated, explained that the webs were demanding that he use magic. Doko pointed out that Rachel's stamina seemed limitless. As the two argued over who deserved help first, the protagonist had an idea. He decided to absorb the concept of the spider web binding Light. Successfully acquiring the concept of the web, he fed the small eagle with that concept. Using the web concept, he created chains and shaped them into a net. In the next instant, he threw the spider web in Rachel's direction, aiming to restrain her. She, still uncontrollable, fell to the ground, trapped under the heavy webbing. Looking at her, the protagonist informed her that there was no way to break free from the chains that drained magic. She struggled to escape, twisting her body against the webbing, which only caused the chains to tighten around her. Then, at a certain moment, both of them blushed at the sight before them. Embarrassed, Light quickly covered the protagonist's eyes, who became annoyed at being the only one who couldn't continue watching. Despite the situation being resolved, the transition to the next room was not occurring. However, the chains were taking effect as Rachel's hair slowly returned to its pink hue. The protagonist noticed that his student ID was functioning again. He asked the others if they should leave. Everyone agreed with the protagonist's idea until a crimson shadow startled them. That shadow appeared near them suddenly. Like an illusion, it began murmuring to the group. It spoke to them, declaring that they had passed the test. They didn't know how to react to the eerie voice. The red shadow condensed into a circle, releasing a vast amount of internal energy. That circle, still speaking to them, molded itself into a red light, transforming into a woman. She continued speaking to them, announcing that she would offer them an opportunity to form a contract with the observer of 10,000 eyes. Meanwhile, outside the tower, the teacher anxiously awaited her students. Her gaze reflected the deep concern she felt as she clutched her student ID. Suddenly, she sensed something happening. A massive teleportation effect began forming in front of the tower, kicking up dust and strong winds in every direction. She quickly raised her arm to shield her eyes from the debris. In that instant, she took note of several people appearing. Leading the group was the protagonist. Yoo-won approached the students, asking, "Is everyone okay? Are you injured or suffering from any side effects?" As she repeated the question, they reassured her, "We're fine. You can calm down." Many of the other students were shocked to see those who had returned. The teacher admitted that she had been extremely worried. "None of you exited the tower even after the evacuation order was issued," she said. Hearing her words, the four students snapped back to reality. The protagonist, contemplating how to explain everything to their teacher, asked, "Can we move to another location first?" The goal was to relocate somewhere more secluded. The protagonist wanted an explanation from her. Since everyone agreed that he should speak on behalf of the group, he began explaining. "I was caught in an irregularity after transitioning to room 4. He described what had happened shortly after they entered and what occurred once they were inside the tower. None of them fully understood what had happened once they were inside. It was even harder to put it all into words. The teacher lowered her head, lost in thought, as if deciding how much to reveal. In the end, she delivered the shocking news to all of them. She announced that one of the students had been removed from the trial due to interference from an external intruder. She stated that the academy was taking full responsibility for handling the situation. However, the students who had been in the same group as the removed participant remained visibly unsettled. She explained that this incident had triggered an irregular event. Then she asked, "Hadn't I already warned you about possible outside intruders?" They revealed that these individuals were dimensional pirates, often targeting new students. If they managed to seize the identification cards, they said, they can disrupt the return process, leaving students stuck in the tower. Upon hearing this, the protagonist asked Mina what had happened to the intruders. Mina replied they managed to get away because the students present at the time couldn't stop them. At that point, the white-haired girl joined the conversation. "Doesn't this feel like some kind of test?" She continued, "Even though they aren't academy students, they keep trying to break in to climb the Tower of Babel. For intruders, the moment new students enter is the perfect opportunity. If they can remove the most promising ones during the overnight challenge, they can earn prestige from the academy, qualifications as climbers, and also seize the identifiers." Doko knew that from the academy's perspective, they could simply say that dealing with these intruders was just another trial for the wicked. Professor Yumina could hardly believe she was hearing this from her student, Dogo Yan. Seeing that her teacher didn't even have a stance on the matter, the white-haired girl simply sighed. She pointed out that there were invaders trying to infiltrate the tower, which was the essence of the academy, and that nothing could be done. This made the girl think that such an academy could not claim to be the best multidimensional academy. With those words, none of the other students could disagree with the young woman's thoughts. However, someone there did disagree. It was Professor Yumina, saying that she had misunderstood something. The professor needed to explain that the academy had a duty to protect students, but once they entered the tower, they were on their own. She added that if the tower chose the invaders over the students, they could not interfere with that. Upon hearing the professor's words, Du became even more upset. A professor stated that was nothing more than the tower's will, which had to be respected. Du was very agitated. She rotated, repeated the professor's words while gripping her identifier. She declared that if that were the case, she disliked the situation even more and would rather teleport away than continue that conversation. The professor, seeing that she had left, could do nothing, even calling out to her if she wouldn't return. Seeing everything, the protagonist intervened and asked the professor to understand as something very bad had happened in the tower. Hearing this, she asked him to tell her exactly what had happened inside the tower. He thought for a few moments, searching for the best way to explain. He explained that before they returned from the tower, they had an encounter. This made Light and Rutel even more uncomfortable with what had happened. Now the protagonist didn't know how to put into words everything that needed to be said. Yumina sensed that something was off and urged the protagonist to tell her what had happened. Ban Yunjan revealed to the professor that they had encountered a constellation. It was known that constellations were formed by transcended patrons or observers who monitored various dimensions. When they found someone who interested them, they formed a contract with that person. They were transcendent beings who exerted influence in this dimension. They could grant powerful magic, special abilities, and powerful artifacts. However, it demanded a lot in return. So far, no one had refused. Everyone knew that in a world where power was valuable, there was nothing sweeter than their tempting offers. Constellations were attractive partners, which is why the professor couldn't believe that the observers were in the same world as them. The protagonist revealed that the observer of 1,000 Eyes had spoken. He also mentioned that this observer had a strange voice and had promised power in exchange for fulfilling his demands. The professor, not fully grasping the true story, found it all incredible. Her expression glowed as she spoke, even with the professor so excited. The pink-haired girl, as well as Light, were not pleased at all. After the protagonist asked the professor if that was truly incredible, and she confirmed it, he posed a sudden and difficult question. He wanted to know the Academy's stance on this matter. At first, the professor was surprised by the student's question, but she affirmed that the Academy officially upheld neutrality. When she mentioned that deep down they encouraged the contracts, the protagonist understood that point. Hearing all this internally, the protagonist couldn't believe that a place like the Academy had no defenses whatsoever. Snapping back to reality due to the professor's insistent questions about what the observer had requested, Ban Yoon grew even more tense. He revealed that the request was for elimination. The professor was shocked by what the protagonist had said. She was confused and wanted him to be clearer in his response. That was when he revealed the full story. The observer had promised to contract 2 of them if they agreed to eliminate the other 2. That was the reason for the group's frustration. He recounted how, earlier, when they were in the tower, the strange voice of the constellation had spoken to them, making a bizarre proposal and swearing loyal love. The old man extended his hand to the 4, waiting for one of them to move first and quickly fulfill his request. The protagonist remembered gritting his teeth in response to so much senseless talk. He wasn't going to join in on this and hoped that Doko wouldn't either. Looking to the side, the protagonist noticed his friend gathering energy. The girl's deep eyes trembled with the amount of power radiating from her. The protagonist told Yumina that Doko was asking them to leave her alone, but the teacher was saddened. She understood that the young woman had released her energy to force the constellation to leave. After recounting the story, the teacher asked, "Does that mean we won't be able to enter the tower?" The protagonist had been counting on the tower for the duel against Director. It was highly inconvenient not to be able to use it. Thinking that he could only train with the remaining time, he called the teacher and said, "I'm considering sending a report about what happened in the tower along with the recording I made." She replied, "That's fine, but if possible, I'd like to hear more about it over a meal." However, when he looked at her, he saw that it wouldn't be possible given everything that had happened. The protagonist explained, "Both of us are visibly exhausted physically and mentally." She was devastated upon understanding the student's feelings. In the end, the teacher praised the 3 for their good work. The protagonist was very grateful for her consideration. Meanwhile, she assured them, "I'll do everything I can to ensure this doesn't happen again," hoping none of them would think poorly of the Academy. With that, she asked everyone to rest well. Light bid farewell to the 2 as he and Rutel left using teleportation, as the protagonist requested that they pass along Doc's regards. He was about to leave as well. But the teacher asked him to wait a moment. She stated that she had a question to ask and warned that she would be direct. Then, with concern, she asked, why has the observer not only promised contracts with 2 of the 4, but instead chosen you and Dubian? The teacher's question left the protagonist shocked, but in the end, he confirmed her suspicion. Deep down, he knew that the observer wasn't just trying to turn them against each other. He seemed to be sifting through something. The observer then pointed at them, stating that they could undoubtedly reach the top together, but only if they got rid of the dead weight. When they heard this, both the blue-eyed blonde boy and the pink-haired girl were devastated. That being, who had appeared out of nowhere and once seemed like the enemy, was now trying to make their two friends fight. The protagonist and the white-haired young woman were taken aback by the proposal. The being promised that, as long as they eliminated the other two, all climbers would receive even more radiant treasure. Take advantage of it, they said, because that is the way of the world. After recounting everything and reflecting on it with Professor Yumina, he returned to his dormitory. He found her sitting in a fetal position. She looked at her companion, wondering if Light hadn't even bothered to take a bath. The protagonist approached Light, trying to lighten the mood. "Your sitting posture is impressive," he commented. "Too bad." He turned to go to the bathroom, while his companion seemed to want to say something. Light asked, "Are you trying to humiliate me?" Rolling his eyes, the protagonist was startled by the question. He couldn't understand why his companion thought that way. Its companion apologized. "In truth, I just wanted to vent a little," he said. "You can insult me if you want. I'm nothing." All of this made the protagonist feel uneasy about being close to Light. A few minutes later, for the first time since entering the room, Light raised his head and looked into the protagonist's eyes. "I hate you," he said, leaving the protagonist unsure of how to react. Although the protagonist also wanted to express his hatred, he had to be content with just thinking about it. For that reason, he endured and waited, telling himself that Light was naive and that could be useful. Despite everything, the protagonist decided to sit down and listen to what his roommate had to say. That's when he told Light, "You can say whatever you want." He wouldn't mind. However, Light remained seated in a depressed manner, but eventually decided to speak. He said that he was also important in his world. He was one of the most talented, and from what the protagonist knew of Light, he had already expected him to be gifted in his world. Light's father had told him that he was exaggerating, as had his family and even his companions. They praised and commented on his talent, even granting him the sacred sword and entrusting him with unparalleled power. He recounted that, thanks to everyone who trusted him, he was able to form a contract with the sacred sword. War asked why they were so worried about the protagonist, who still tried to tell Light that he was talented, not needing to take into account the words of that ridiculous entity. While listening to what the protagonist was saying, Light widened his eyes. As for him, the situation was different. Because of that, Light used the protagonist's words against him, stating that it was easy to ignore the entity since he had been chosen. Light, deeply offended, continued his complaints. To begin with, they were divine beings, transcended beings far stronger and more recognized than humans. He couldn't believe that the protagonist, Deco, could refuse so easily. Upon hearing that, the protagonist was surprised by the question. He more or less understood what Light was trying to insinuate with his words. He lowered his head and affirmed. He had rejected it because that kind of proposal was meaningless. He also explained that there were many ways to stand out. Light, however, stated that he was only saying that because he had overwhelming talent. He, to be honest, said that if he were able to receive a choice from a divine being, he would hesitate, but with some reluctance. The protagonist couldn't believe he was hearing Light say that he wouldn't reject it so easily. He admitted that he might have made that choice, but the fact was that he felt resentful and afraid. Faced with that unsettling revelation, the protagonist couldn't say anything. After his bath, he sighed several times while drying his hair. He looked around and noticed that, now calmer, Light had gone to bed. Sensing that he was more at ease, the protagonist looked at him for a moment. He even thought that he was asleep and decided to leave. But at that moment, the young man called him. Light, now with a guilty expression on his face, apologized to the protagonist for crying like that. He also said, what had happened wasn't just his fault. And so, he apologized for acting that way. Since his friend was calmer and apologizing, the protagonist gave a slight smile. It's fine, he said, because we're friends. After hearing those words, Light had to try hard not to cry. The protagonist assured him that he could always talk to him. Then he mentioned that he would need to leave for a while. After that, he opened his inventory and pulled out a mug of hot chocolate, planning to leave it for Light. Placing the cup there, he remarked, unpleasant things tend to go away after eating something sweet. After leaving the room, the protagonist thought for a bit. He felt that he had changed since the first time. While he was still lost in thought, the white-haired girl approached, and he hadn't even noticed her presence. She quickly moved toward him, her eyes shining, and declared, "You're finally back." She also said she was relieved that she didn't have to enter. When the young woman moved toward him so suddenly, he was startled. "What are you doing in the male dormitory?" he asked. She told him to be quiet, claiming that it wasn't a crime if no one found out. Before he could say anything, the girl grabbed him by the collar. Now sitting on a bench in an area of the academy, the protagonist asked her, "Why did you come here?" "Only because Annex Cafe was too crowded," she said. I ended up there after wandering around for a while. However, she admitted she was curious about how Light was doing. The protagonist reminded her not to speak that way. She replied, I'm just stating the truth. In my opinion, she continued, Light's real strength all comes from his sword. She asked, if you won, didn't you feel the same way? She explained that Light's power, his sharp combat instincts, and even his special abilities all came from his sword. She added a few more criticisms about Light. He doesn't even fully understand the situation, she pointed out. Feeling frustrated, the protagonist asked her to stop, but she concluded, in difficult moments, Light sometimes loses confidence and fighting spirit. Not satisfied with only talking about Light, she also mentioned Rachel's weaknesses. Hearing that, the protagonist sighed, unsure if she was trying to provoke her friend or genuinely worried. In the end, he looked up at the sky and asked, are you okay? That question surprised her. He had to clarify, you seem different ever since you encountered the divine being. She had shown her irritation even with the professor, and he asked again if she was all right. The young woman was startled, her face turning red. In a moment of shyness, she asked, did you figure it out using your abilities? He simply tilted his head back. Returning to a normal position, he took out some more hot chocolate from his inventory for the two of them. Handing her the cup, he revealed, I don't need any special skills to read you. You reveal everything through your expressions. She remained calm, simply taking the hot chocolate. Then she took the first sip of the drink, wondering if he was trying to comfort her. After the first sip, she remarked, this is sweeter than I expected. The protagonist, curious, asked, what did you expect from a hot chocolate drink? She then remembered the observer they had encountered in the tower and shared her thoughts with him. Do you think the two of them thought the same way? So many ideas were coming from her, and it startled him. The beings they had encountered in the tower existed only to destroy, driven by their desires. She asked the protagonist, do you think that both the being and I shared the same mindset? Faced with this question, the protagonist was once again taken aback. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to answer, she responded for him. In essence, it was the same thing. She felt that if the two of them weren't useful in some way, she would have considered discarding them. Her words shocked the protagonist. She realized that if she had been more radical, she would have been carried away by the idea of choosing only the best. She could have easily neglected Light and the incompetent pink-haired girl. Dew blamed herself for the uselessness of the other two. She thought she shouldn't have had such thoughts. The protagonist, unsure of what to say, took a sip of his drink, seeking some operation in it. After a while, and hearing the girl reaffirm her thoughts for a moment, he decided to look at her. He told her that she was naive as well. She blushed and turned her face away from him. She had just confessed her deepest thoughts. When she asked if he thought the other two had talent, it was obvious that he believed they did. Meanwhile, Light in his room was staring at his cup while the protagonist told his friend about their qualities. Since he had a tendency to rely too much on a sacred sword, Light picked up his cup of hot chocolate in his room, unable to keep up with the circumstances. However, the protagonist thought the same applied to Rutel, as she possessed incredibly strong ability. The problem was that all that potential was being wasted due to her internal struggles. If both of them could overcome and correct their weaknesses and flaws, he knew they would become strong fighters. For that reason, he tried to convince his companion that their talents would surprise them both. The white-haired girl tried to follow the protagonist's reasoning, but she didn't have the same capacity. In silence, gripping the sides of her cup, she showed that she didn't have the same confidence in their friends as he did. The problem wasn't that she didn't believe in the others, but that she decided to trust the protagonist. This surprised him at first. That encouraged him to ask her whether, if their two friends trained, they would become stronger. The boy suddenly stood up saying, if things happen as I'm saying, and if the duo manages to overcome the challenges and grow, will you admit that I was right? However, if the result isn't to your liking, you'll have to take responsibility, she added. The protagonist didn't like at all what she was saying, that he would have to bear responsibility. However, the young woman left him behind, and all the surprise and doubt still lingered in him. As she jumped down, she warned that if she wasted even a minute of her time, it would be his fault. He would be held responsible. Still, she bid him farewell and asked him to meet up with the other two idiots the next morning. The next day, an intense battle was already underway in the training room. The protagonist watched the fight with a distant look on his face. Light was trying to advance against Dew, attempting to fight barehanded. However, despite all his effort, he couldn't stop the girl from throwing him straight toward the protagonist. Light groaned on the ground, searching for his friend in a completely opposite direction from where he actually was. Driving himself in his direction, Light cried while demanding an explanation from the protagonist. He insisted, asking why he was the only one being beaten by that brute who kept attacking him mercilessly. When she approached the two, cracking her knuckles, she scared them even more. She stated that they were undergoing physical training, so it was normal for some blows to be a little stronger. Giving him a harsh reality check, she reminded Light that he wasn't like Ban, who learned things quickly. Light then said that he needed his sword, but his friend and trainer didn't allow it. The blonde boy was frustrated, pleaded with the protagonist to hand him his sword. However, the protagonist insisted that he get it on his own since he was being trained by Dew. Looking at Light, he wanted him to believe in them, at least this time, that it was all for his growth. Reluctantly, seeing how much the protagonist insisted, Light agreed. Lowering his head, he stood up, thinking that this might mean something. He was determined to trust and try. But just as they were preparing to start again, the only encouragement he received was a foot approaching his face. It was his colleague Dew, who decided to catch him off guard. After telling him so many times not to let that happen, Light still wasn't ready. The protagonist was surprised at how fast his friend had gotten close to Light. She continued launching her strikes to train him, who desperately needed any reinforcement possible. She thought he shouldn't just rely on his eyes to sense the attacks coming his way. As long as he didn't understand what was happening, she would keep attacking him over and over again. Taking the opportunity, she landed more hits on him. Frustrated, she told him to pay attention to his stance. He needed to react quickly, not just with his eyes, but by feeling where the attacks were coming from. As the young woman continued taunting Light, the protagonist watched the fight with his all-seeing eyes. He noticed that at that moment, Light's stats were dropping unilaterally in real time. Normally, Light was a monster who could easily handle a Rector, but for some reason, things had changed. Now that he had to avoid using his sword, his abilities seemed non-existent. Still watching the fight, he thought that if this change had been caused by the sword, then Light's condition might be even worse than he had imagined. Meanwhile, the girl kept up her intense battle. She wasn't just launching physical attacks, but also psychological ones. She needed him to understand quickly. She kept asking, is the real Light not actually a person, but just a sword? Even though he denied it once or twice, he kept getting hit. But already tired of his friend's provocations, he finally started to fight back. A strange power began to surge through Light's body. Like powerful flames, and for the first time, he tried to take the initiative. He attempted to throw a punch at Dew, leaving the girl completely surprised. It was an explosive energy strike aimed at her, but Dew managed to dodge in time. However, one of Light's attacks caused a massive wave of air, leaving the protagonist speechless at what had just happened. Beside him, Rudel also couldn't understand how something like that had occurred. Everyone watched as the young blonde transformed into a woman. His features had changed, his curves became pronounced, and his hair had grown long. The moment Light stopped hiding and gave up, whatever he had been suppressing was unleashed. Dew looked at Light's appearance and became very irritated. However, at that moment, the power surrounding Light began to manifest and converge. A bright glow and intense light emanated directly from his chest, making him writhe in pain. It was so intense that he crouched on the ground while the protagonist ran toward him. There was nothing he could do as his white-haired friend stopped him, telling him not to worry because Light was fine. She watched as Light returned to his original form, sensing that he wasn't the real problem, but it wasn't something easy to resolve. Sitting on the ground, he looked up with a look of disbelief, approaching and gazing at Light. Dew asked if he knew what his problem was, and at that moment, the confirmation came. She and Ban had been right. Light believed he couldn't keep going like this, but he asked her to continue fighting with him. She gave a strange look before accepting the request. Before anything else, I need to apologize to Light, she said. I was mistaken. Seeing the young woman apologize in front of him, he felt embarrassed. He scratched his head, saying, "You don't need to apologize." Dew's next words, however, were meant to sting. "I thought you were naive and clueless, but not a completely clueless fool," she said. At that moment, Rudel tugged on Ban's shirt. "We should train too," she said. He paid no attention to her at first, his focus elsewhere. The protagonist's eyes glowed with a strong golden hue. As he observed Light, two concepts were released from him, the demonic spirit and the sacred spirit. He didn't understand how two such opposite powers could coexist in the same place. He thought this might be a cause of everything. He even considered discussing it with a colleague, but decided to wait. First, he apologized to Rutel. She accepted his apology with a smile. "It's fine," she said, "but I still want to train." In that moment, he recalled how she had looked after her own transformation. She, too, had thought things might go wrong, but she believed he would find a way. He quickly summoned his snake, knowing it was the only way to restrain her in case she transformed. Even so, he had some reservations, but the girl was firm in her conviction. She wanted to gain control over her own power, so she could help everyone. Determined to grant her request, he walked over to the rack where several wooden swords were placed to choose one. After selecting one, he tossed it toward the girl. She caught the sword with a curious look. Unlike the battle between Dello and Light, the protagonist wanted him and the girl to determine their own pace. He didn't want them to be like the other pair, and the pink-haired girl understood his reasoning. Once they both had their wooden swords, the protagonist asked if they could start. As the girl said she would do her best, something surfaced in the protagonist's mind. He thought that this was what he had always dreamed of for his university life, the essence of youth he had imagined. It wasn't about chaotic fights with senseless, powerful strikes. It was about young men and women encouraging one another. Just thinking about it, the protagonist smiled slightly, blushing as he realized how lucky he was. The girl, noticing that he was lost in thought, asked if they should begin. As soon as they decided to start, the adorable pink-haired girl unleashed her full strength, revealing sharp claws. 5 minutes later, the beast revealed its more feral side. Dust filled the entire room, blurring the air. Feeling a surge of fear, the protagonist quickly summoned his snake. Eve transformed into chains, wrapping around the girl at his command. The chains tightened, sapping her energy until she grew exhausted. Soon, her power faded, and she slowly regained consciousness. Relief was evident on his face as he nearly slumped. Concerned, she hurried to his side. "Has this happened many times?" she asked softly. He nodded, admitting it had happened over 10 times. The girl's eyes filled with sadness, regretting that she had worn him out, but he reassured her with a gentle smile. Ruffling her hair, he reminded her of his promise to help. Still with his hand resting on her head, he said firmly that he was ready to face whatever came. Suddenly, both were caught off guard by an approaching presence. The white-haired girl's expression showed clear irritation toward the protagonist. Her face held unmistakable disdain as she dragged Light by his legs, furious that while she trained hard, the protagonist had been calmly chatting with the beast. He was surprised by her comment. Rutel tried to defend the protagonist. Upon hearing that, Deiko crouched down and asked, "Do you have ulterior motives?" Then she remarked, "Training with a distracted mind is disrespectful to an opponent." The pink-haired girl sat on the floor, head lowered, feeling guilty. Du took the opportunity to make her feel even worse. After all of this, the protagonist turned and saw that the girl was deeply depressed. Seeing her so down, he realized that she was too soft when it came to Dako. He knew Rutschel hadn't had enough time to take care of her mental health. Even so, she was trying her best. With that in mind, he assured everyone, everything is fine. Dako was curious about what he meant by that. Answering her, he revealed, "I recently made a request to the professor. When I leave the floating island, I want to take a rabbit with me," and the professor agreed. Dako, assuming he was referring to her, thought his request was great, but his words shattered her expectations. He informed the pink-haired girl, "From this moment on, I'll be taking you with me." Not only was the white-haired girl shocked, but the blue-eyed blonde boy wasn't happy either. Beather. Rutel could hardly believe he had made that decision for her. The next day, the protagonist went to a women's clothing store. He sat on a bench explaining a few things to people over the communicator. He had already assured them that he wouldn't be staying out overnight, and he would definitely return before dawn. Daka was furious as he spoke to that duo. His eyes widened when he glanced to the side. The pink-haired girl had just finished changing into the outfit Ban had chosen, a white blouse paired with a pink skirt. The combination gave her an adorable look, matching her hair. She then looked at the protagonist and asked, "How do I look?" She thought she might be revealing too much of her appearance. He quickly placed his hand over his mouth to hide the smile of joy that spread across his face when he saw her. After that, the two left the shop and walked through the streets. She was amazed by everything she saw. The protagonist crossed the street, calling her to walk a little further, as they were in another district filled with department stores. As she tried to follow the protagonist, she ended up in the middle of the crowd. By the time she noticed, several people had already gathered around her. She tried to hurry, fearing that, at this rate, she would end up getting lost. Just when she thought she was lost, someone approached and grabbed her arm. It was Ban who pulled her out of the crowd. He apologized and admitted that he had forgotten it was her first time in a place like that. Rutschel blushed upon hearing Ban while he held her hand. He knew how crowded the shopping district could be. Quickly, he turned away and hid his face, flushed with embarrassment. Because of that, he didn't notice that her face was also red. The two walked in silence. During their walk, they ate various street foods, including meat and crepes. They also visited a candy shop, where they found stuffed animals. She won a penguin plushie from Ban. Later, they ran freely, startling a group of white pigeons, which flew away, making the scene even more beautiful. Rel blushed. The two were truly enjoying themselves. When lunchtime arrived, the pair sat at a restaurant to eat. He asked the young woman if she was enjoying the dishes, since they were all made from monster meat. For her, it wasn't a problem. She thought it was absolutely delicious, and for him, who was eating this type of food for the first time, it tasted better than he had imagined. Rel believed she was eating meat and exploring the city. As she ate, her thoughts drifted and her expression quickly changed. While chewing a piece of meat, the protagonist noticed the change in her face. Seeing that she looked troubled, he asked, "Is something wrong? Did you not like the food?" But the reason was different. She felt overwhelmingly excited after visiting so many wonderful places. He was surprised to learn why she seemed so down. She was questioning whether what she was doing was fair, since she didn't even know if it would help her abilities. The protagonist pressed his lips together, irritated and somewhat upset. In the next moment, he found it important to show her the concept of worry. He asked her to look at his hands for a moment, telling her that the worry she was feeling was taking shape. Until recently, my ability could only sense the anger within you, he explained. But now, it's different. Just by spending time together, I can pick up on these emotions. Rudel agreed with the protagonist's words, reflecting on the problems they were facing at that moment. He thought that finally, she might be able to see the symbol above his hand. At that moment, the protagonist closed the hand that held the worry, along with his other hand, dissipating the concept of worry with a bright smile. He shoved his empty hands, declaring that the worries had disappeared. The young woman was amazed by the glowing light, vanishing like tiny stars before her eyes. She wasn't just excited by the light, but also by his words when Bam promised to always solve her problems. Hearing his promise, she agreed, finding everything he said fascinating. It felt like magic, as if it could become reality. The protagonist recalled their last battle when she had attacked him so aggressively. The young woman then changed the subject, speaking more timidly. I want to get to know the best, she said. The protagonist was curious about whom Rachel was referring to. Of course, she was talking about Du Yan. Rudel rubbed her hands together in a soothing motion. She admitted that Du could be scary, but it seemed like she liked Ban a lot. However, she quickly disagreed with that idea. It's more like Dao treats him as if he belongs to her, as if he were a sword. Relling laughed at the protagonist's comment. She found it hilarious that he was comparing himself to a weapon. He didn't understand why she was laughing, as he thought the analogy was odd. However, she said that she felt relieved, surprising the protagonist. She gave him a bright, beautiful smile as she told him, I thought you were some kind of omniscient mage or something like that. The protagonist didn't understand what she meant, nor why she was getting so close as she spoke. She grabbed his hand, pulling him along. Can we leave now that you've finished eating? Her smile was much brighter than before, showing that her worries had truly faded. As a thank you for everything you've done for me today, she said, I'll choose an outfit for you. The young girl walked ahead, smiling brightly while he carried the shopping bags behind her. At the academy, Professor Yumina sat in a dark room in a meeting. Along with her was the filming robot Ban had given her. It seemed to be under pressure, but she asked it to endure a little longer. It'll be over soon. As they watched the recordings, one of the professors grew furious. Information about the tower is spreading, he said. We need to find out who allowed the climb. He despised lower beings for their transgressions. A blue-haired professor asked, Is there a way to stop the information about the tower from spreading? Another professor responded, There's no actual violation in the videos. Even so, several professors remained angry. At one point, someone asked for silence. This person then spoke directly to Professor Yumina. He stated that this was clearly an infraction and wanted to know if she had thought about how she planned to take responsibility for it. Faced with the professor's arbitrary stance, she simply stared at him, holding back her emotions, unlike the robot beside her. Some time ago, Yumina had watched the recordings made by the protagonist. She slapped her own face, realizing that they had truly gone that far. When Van had said he wanted to climb the tower and record a video, there had been no reason to oppose it. She had even thought it wouldn't work since she already knew that external machines and artifacts didn't function inside the tower. And yet, Ban had ignored common sense and produced results. She ended the video playback shown by the small robot. Yuna was certain that Ban still didn't realize what was happening. It wasn't just the fact that he had brought a recording from the tower. It was the fact that Ban had created a tool that worked inside the tower, something incredibly difficult. The complications didn't stop there. He wanted to publish the video on his channel, knowing that this topic would attract attention. That kind of rebellion would increase his group's popularity among the Academy students. And she was somewhat worried that the information about the tower, which they had worked so hard to obtain, would be spread carelessly. She wondered if he wouldn't regret it. However, he asserted that hard work should be shared. Moreover, aside from his filming robot, there was no other way to record video, so he would essentially have a monopoly on it. He planned to edit and remove certain topics such as the constellation. But before publishing the video, he believed she had always stood by his side and thought his progress would be incredible, though it would have some consequences. He was already aware of that, and it was exactly as Yuma had anticipated in their previous conversations. That incident would attract both major and minor figures. For that reason, Ban stated that he wanted to stabilize his position and asked the professor if she didn't think she would feel safer by looking after them. She secretly smiled, not believing he could be so admirable. Responding to the protagonist, she told him that if he wanted to feel safe, he should avoid causing accidents. She had already developed great expectations. She felt that the things Ban had created would lead to something immense. Because of that, she remained silent. And in the meeting, one of the professors asked what she was thinking about, reflecting on everything Ban had done and accomplished. She decided that she would support him. So she turned to the professor and asked, filming and publishing a video of the tower was merely a personal matter, so it's not your problem to discuss. She made it clear that she didn't understand what he meant by wanting to hold her responsible. The professor, Alex Canton, had been the one pressuring Yumina, acting against her students. He started laughing, calling her a beautiful liar, raising his voice in an attempt to rally the other professors against her. "Am I the only one who thinks her reasoning sounds like an attempt to defend the student?" he asked. At that moment, the blue-haired professor ordered Canton to be quiet. She was Talia Liriana from the Artifact Creation Department. She turned to Yumina and asked, "Who is this student? He's just an ordinary student." However, another professor couldn't accept this. He was from the Aura Combat Studies Department. He stated that there was a limit to selfishness and that the information about the tower was centered around the academy. At that moment, Yumina confronted the professor. She pointed out that his words were strange. The reason no one had ever filmed inside the tower before was because the tower itself blocked such attempts. Professor Canton interrupted Yumina with a smile, concealing his own interest. He demanded that she explain the principles behind the ability. Yumina fell silent upon hearing this question. On the other side of the table, Talia spoke up. "I have spent 200 years studying these matters," she said. "I know very well that artifacts created outside the tower don't function inside it, especially recording equipment. It is widely known that no circuit can handle the waves demanded by the tower." The more she researched, the more convinced she became that external machines would never function inside. Hearing all those words, Professor Yumina added to the discussion. "My student has succeeded," she said. This made Talia even more curious. "This is exactly what I wanted to know," she said. "Who is this boy?" She was irritated because he came from a dimension that didn't even possess mana, making it seem like he was the only one who was special. As soon as she finished saying those words, she realized something. The artifact that had recorded that footage was now with Yumina. The blue professor's expression turned scholarly and determined as she put on her gloves and requested the artifact. Yuma quickly hugged the small robot, refusing to hand it over. She stated that she had been asked to bring the artifact to the meeting, but it was an achievement made by her student, and she couldn't let anyone take it away. One professor after another opposed her. Suddenly, someone raised a hand, asking everyone to stop. It was the professor sitting at the corner of the table near her. That professor was the vice president of the academy and the head of the constellation department. Placing a finger to his lips with a smile, he asked everyone to remain silent so that the heated discussion could settle. Everyone agreed. However, after a while, he was the one to break the silence by suddenly calling out to Talia. The professor became extremely flustered upon hearing the vice president praising her and acknowledging her efforts of 200 years in research. Recognizing that she was someone capable of making sound judgments, he remarked that the artifact created by the student was indeed special. The professor stammered in response. After hearing her confirmation, the vice president stated that this was surely a difficult fact for the professors to accept. When the professors questioned what he meant, he proceeded to explain in simple terms. The student in question had been recognized by the tower. Following that revelation, the professors were left astonished upon hearing such a statement, especially since the student had only entered the tower for a single day. One professor tried to argue with him, saying that his claims were reckless, even if he was the vice president. But he didn't care about the commotion, merely shrugging it off. He said they could believe it or not. He also mentioned that there was another reason why this student was special. Then he asked the student's professor to explain. He inquired if she would be willing to reveal anything more from the recordings that the professors could understand better. The situation worsened as the professors grew furious upon realizing that the professor had been hiding something. The vice president then declared, "I'll tell you everything." He revealed that Ban Yuan and his companions were the only ones chosen by the constellation. The professors noticed the rage building within Talia. She couldn't believe that someone had climbed the tower for the first time and already achieved such recognition. At that moment, Yumina spoke to the vice president, saying making contact with the constellations had also been an accomplishment of the students. Honoring the professor's statement, he requested that she answer truthfully the question he was about to ask as vice president. Her 4 students had formed contracts with the constellations. She paused for a moment, wondering why he was pushing so hard on this matter. Nevertheless, she told the truth. None of them had actually formed a contract, she said, which greatly intrigued the vice president. Making a decision, Scene announced to everyone present, "I will consider Ban Yuan and all the other students of Class 11 as my own students as well." Upon hearing this, the professors quickly urged him to reconsider, reminding him that he had just stated that none of the students had made a contract with the constellations. The vice president, seeing their lack of understanding, proceeded to clarify. To him, it didn't matter whether or not the contract had been formed. What mattered was that they had been chosen by the constellations, which already proved their exceptional abilities. This left Yumina surprised. After asserting that other constellations were also interested in them, he began pressuring the other professors. Faced with this, none of the professors could refute Xenon's words, not even Alex Canton. Thus, Steven continued stating, "I am the professor responsible for guiding the students chosen by the constellations. And if Ban Yu-won had been chosen, then he would be his student as well." In the end, he stared at all the professors with his golden eyes. Now that the professors had accepted his stance, the vice president moved forward with his agenda and introduced the next topic. The beautiful Yumina was lost in thought, looking down, seemingly realizing that this meeting was not about deciding how to treat Ban. The vice president's words conveyed the president's intentions as he continued talking about the students. The more he spoke, the clearer his message became, addressing topics that confirmed his point. He was delivering a message from the president stating that professors could make requests to understand the students' abilities. After hearing the vice president declare that Ban was untouchable, the professors remained silent until the meeting's conclusion. After stating that he hoped they had understood and wishing them a good weekend, the vice president disappeared. Yumina sighed in relief, never imagining that her student received so many favors from the director. In that brief moment of relief, one of the professors approached her, Alex Canton, inviting her to have some drinks at a bar. He said he wanted to toast the student's success. At that man's invitation, Yumina turned green with disgust but didn't say anything. She simply teleported somewhere else. The other professors, noticing her reaction, quickly tried to console Canton. The next day, several people surrounded the protagonist in the cafeteria. Many people wanted to introduce themselves. Everyone wanted to be friends with Ban, even offering him an invitation to the student council. The protagonist was overwhelmed by so many people, and so many dating and mean requests. Meanwhile, he met up with the other two companions and wondered what was happening with all the commotion. Light explained the situation and asked if Dao remembered the channel. He revealed that the channel had gone viral. At this point, it was hard to find anyone at the academy who hadn't seen their videos. Hearing the explanation and looking around, Zhu saw several people watching the video Ban had created. He found Ban's ideas and skills truly impressive. However, Rutel, observing the scene, pondered over Du's reaction and what was happening. At that moment, the protagonist placed his tray on the table, asking, "What's going on this morning?" Exhausted, he couldn't help but rest his head on the table. Overwhelmed by everything happening, the protagonist wanted to tease Light, saying that he had many fans and should be kinder to them. They were suddenly interrupted by a loud voice that caught Ban's attention. Someone was saying that it was a joke to make a fuss over manipulated images. Some guys were baiting the protagonist's group. They looked in Ban's direction, saying he should wait because the next day, all of his lies would be exposed. The antagonist then remembered that the next day was the scheduled duel with Erector. It would be the day he faced the Stone Boy, Erector. After hearing all the insults from those guys, he realized they were exactly the ones who would be rooting against him in the duel. Light also agreed with the protagonist's assumption, while Rutel offered him support. Wiping her mouth after eating, the white-haired girl told him that he should respond in the best way possible, especially for those watching and supporting the protagonist. She gave him a bright smile. The next day, the protagonist stepped into the arena, where the assistant professor was already present. He informed them that the duel would be broadcast live. If both of them agreed to the fight being recorded and streamed live, he said they needed to sign the document that appeared before them. To their surprise, there were several precautionary terms for the duel. If anyone became incapacitated or surrendered, the duel would be terminated. A burly man approached the protagonist, suggesting a negotiation. The protagonist, surprised by the negotiation request, thought the man might be a subscriber to his channel and had watched the videos. However, the stone man asked Ban if he was scared, stating that he could surrender. But for that to happen, he said, "You have to crawl between my legs and bark like a dog. Only then will I accept your surrender." Hearing that, the protagonist was shocked. Although the fight was being broadcast to the entire school, only 2 classes were present in the arena. The troublemakers from the rector's class were cheering for him, full of hatred toward Ban. Ortima, who had been defeated by the white-haired girl last time, watched the arena with a curious look. However, his gaze was not on the fighters, but on Du. She was with the other 2, trying to gauge the audience's reaction with light glances. He informed the girl that the viewers of the broadcast had already reached 10,000 and many were cursing Van. Du had already expected this. In the best-case scenario, the people who liked him. Thanks to the videos, it would only be a small group. That's why she wanted Bannon to prove now that so many people were watching whether he had the strength to reach the top or not. The protagonist was thinking about Erector's words about crawling and barking. It made him secretly smile. He had never imagined he would actually hear something so pathetic. It was so ridiculous that it sounded like something out of a third-grade soap opera. So when he turned his attention to Erector, he gave him a look that seemed frightening, as if asking if he had put in so much effort just to provoke him. Erector returned the same grin to the protagonist, asking how long he would be able to keep acting so calm. The protagonist shrugged. "Whether I'm acting calm or not, Erector should find out by facing me." With that, the protagonist drew his sword and taunted Erector. Erector got annoyed, gritting his teeth in frustration at the provocation. Now, he seemed to be boiling with rage. He urged the assistant professor to declare the start of the fight immediately. Hearing him and complying with his request, the assistant professor raised her hand and announced, "It's now Bannon versus Erector." With permission granted, Erector almost instantly charged at the protagonist. Relying solely on his superior size to win, Erector's footsteps made the entire arena tremble as he launched his massive fist toward the protagonist, who remained still. But the fists were just about to reach Ban, he simply moved. His legs moved swiftly while his eyes remained focused. The protagonist internally praised Erector for taking the initiative, but his sword moved and he passed by the big guy. As he wondered what Erector could do, being so slow, Ban's strike landed on the opponent's face as if it were crumpling like a sheet of paper. With that blow, Ban knocked Erector down, gaining the upper hand in the battle for a few seconds. He felt that to face that stone, he knew it was more efficient to use the reverse method. The protagonist and the others had gathered in the training room the day before his encounter with Rutel. Everyone told the protagonist that before using a technique, there were trials and errors. Therefore, he learned that when facing a new opponent with a new attack, he should be able to use the technique. Only then could he say he was mastering the reverse method. After the theoretical approach, he would move on to the practical. The protagonist had a sword to try and block at least one of the strikes. He trembled with fear, but he knew that she was teaching that method so that Erector wouldn't even be able to touch him. The protagonist, having executed the technique moments ago, felt that this was true. Unlike Doctor, who was much worse, Erector managed to get up, still wondering what happened. However, before he could understand, another attack was launched in his direction. Erector fell to his knees. As the protagonist watched, he noticed the effect conveyed by the technique the moment before his attack landed. His sword had been infused with a wave of energy. Thanks to that, Erector's stone-hard body transmitted the energy like a ripple, causing severe damage and leaving Erector furious, even questioning how Ban could hurt him. The protagonist, crouching down to be at the same height as the big guy, apologized and told him to stop complaining. Looking into Ector's eyes, he said that if he didn't want to continue, they could stop right there. Those words made Ector even angrier at the provocation from such an insignificant human. He got up and charged at Ban with full force, but the protagonist was too fast to be hit. Erector was seriously afraid. He couldn't believe that a mutt from a lower dimension was belittling him. Erector shouted these words furiously. The more he shouted, the more it bothered the protagonist's ears. As he understood what was happening after those shouts, several concepts materialized around Erector's arm. They extended upward, becoming much larger. Erector's hand struck the arena floor, causing a massive impact. Even so, the protagonist mocked Erector internally, thinking he was too naive. He thought that, at the very least, Erector should have tried a different method after failing the first time. But Erector didn't care about any strategy. His eyes revealed the rage he had been holding back. He tried to crush the protagonist with his massive body. Luckily, Ban was quick enough to dodge his attacks. Erector kept attacking in the same way, extending his hand to try and strike the protagonist. However, the protagonist's sword slashed swiftly, infused with concepts. The massive stone arm cracked, now being cut apart by the protagonist's attack. Faced with multiple identical attacks, Ban had no choice but to counterattack. Just like the first time, taking heavy damage, Erector screamed in a mix of pain and hatred. While the fight was happening, many people watched and followed the live broadcast. Among them, even the directors were keeping an eye on what was happening, even though it was an irrelevant fight he was watching. Just like the vice director, many people were watching and couldn't understand what was really going on. Light told the pink-haired girl everyone's reaction was expected. They didn't believe it, even when seeing it with their own eyes. Now everyone had to accept that. Compared to when he first appeared at the academy, the protagonist was several times stronger. That was undeniable. The students of Class 1, the same as the rector, couldn't believe it. Their companion had been taken out right at the beginning of the fight. Now they were wondering if the ability shown in the video from the channel could be real. Even the substitute teacher was fearful, seeing how easily the rector was defeated. He knew that just a week ago, that boy had been feeling weak to the point that he asked for a week to train. The professor wasn't quite sure what happened to the protagonist in just a few days. While the professor was dealing with a message he received from the teacher's assembly, the protagonist was thinking about what to do. Eric stood in front of him, unable to move. Attacking someone who couldn't even make a move was ridiculous. He stared at him for a while, hoping he would get up so they could continue the fight. While he was waiting, he heard the professor, who had already raised his arm, declaring that the fight was over. The professor's announcement took both of them by surprise. It was the decision of the observing teachers of that match, the professor stated, and I am declaring the duel finished. As the professor spoke, Erector's eyes were filled with hatred. He felt as though the professor was deeming him incapable of continuing the fight. Despite Erector's outrage, the assistant professor announced that the duel would end at that moment. Even though the protagonist tried to say something, the professor stated that neither of their objections would be accepted. Ban still gritted his teeth when the assistant professor ordered him to leave the arena. Very upset, but with no other choice, he left the arena while muttering complaints. Drawing his sword, he was frustrated because he hadn't been able to decide whether he would win or not. He was upset and frustrated, but at least he hadn't lost. The sadness in his friend's eyes was evident. As he left the arena feeling down, he heard Rector calling him an insect and telling him to wait a moment. Even though the assistant professor stated that he had been deemed incapable, Hector didn't care about losing to someone like that insect. Looking Ban in the eyes, he wanted to put an end to that humiliation once and for all, even if it meant going against the professor's word. With that in mind, he charged at the protagonist first. That was when his arm became covered in thorns, and he shouted his intentions at Ban. The assistant professor was alarmed, yelling for Ban Yoo-won to dodge immediately. However, Ban simply ran his hand over his sword again, unwilling to dodge. Even under Hector's furious gaze, he remained calm and still while the giant bellowed. He knew his opponent had already been ordered to stop, but he wouldn't. He thought himself superior because of his background. He believed he was untouchable and didn't need to follow the rules. With that thought, Ban infused some concepts into his sword. Observing everything, Ban knew that the fight had only been stopped because of the teacher's decision, and now that man was acting purely out of pride. That's why he raised his sword, determined to end it as quickly as possible. Now, with his eyes glowing in a different color and a newfound determination, he was ready. As soon as his opponent attempted to strike him, Ban simply counterattacked. Erector's eyes rolled back in rage and pain, and the protagonist believed he had done the right thing. After so many insults, he couldn't stay silent any longer. Erector only stopped screaming when he realized what had happened after the protagonist's strike. Erector had lost his arm. The students from Erector's class held their heads all wide-eyed in disbelief. Even Ban's friends couldn't believe what they were seeing. Everyone began voicing their opinions loudly. At that moment, a system window appeared before the protagonist, making him look at it with suspicion. The system message stated that, if he wanted, he could absorb the monster's strength from Erector's severed arm. Meanwhile, the assistant professor ordered the stone-skinned man not to move. He would be taken to the medical ward. The giant lay on the ground, trembling and grinding his teeth in pain. Now he was feeling the price of his humiliation. The assistant professor was taking the initial measures while the protagonist looked to the side. Now the protagonist was receiving a scolding from the assistant professor, who had already stated that he should have just dodged. The protagonist tried to explain himself, apologizing. As everything had happened so quickly, it was difficult for him to react differently. The professor was indignant when he found the protagonist's excuse weak. But as the professor grew angrier with the student, he received a notification instructing him to stop. The vice director would provide him with the answers he wanted. The assistant professor showed Ban the vice director's message. The message greeted him and stated that the person speaking was the teacher's representative. He said that from that moment on, he would ask questions, and Ban would have to answer honestly. He wanted to know if Ban had been unable to Hodge. The teacher's representative stated that their forces were so conflicting that even the teachers had decided to end the duel. Now he demanded an answer that could be accepted by everyone and insisted on knowing why Ban had not dodged the attack. The protagonist simply stared back with a closed expression, offering no response. He thought that even after acquiring the ability, he had never deeply reflected on what the so-called spirit words truly were. Now, with the question consuming him, he felt an overwhelming pressure beyond the screen and wondered who that person could be. Because of this, he asked the person on the other side how they had guessed. Since he hadn't dodged the opponent's attack, but instead counterattacked, he believed that a student who disrespected the authority of the teachers and acted however they pleased deserved to face the consequences. The person on the other side wanted to know if he was saying that teachers were the authority. The protagonist agreed and continued, saying that, moreover, in an official setting where rules should be strictly followed, this was necessary to prevent other students from disregarding the rules and attempting stealth attacks. While exchanging messages, the group of teachers could hear everything that was happening. He continued, saying that if he had responded peacefully in that situation, it could have spread the impression that he was weak, and that the rules wouldn't need to be followed when dealing with a student from lower dimensions. It wasn't just the teachers, the director, or the vice director who had access to Ban's words, but the entire academy. Many people were following the screen where he spoke about the rules and about people from lower dimensions. He continued, saying that even though he had taken action a short time, he believed his actions were justified. The vice director found it interesting when the student said he acted to defend the academy's principles. The vice director knew that he was responding intelligently. Aware that there were many ears listening, he noticed that the young man had above-average intelligence. He had expanded the problem between two people to involve the entire school. Trying to act with intelligence as well, the vice director said, "The student's words are correct." He continued, "Students who disregard the match rules deserve to be punished according to regulations. However, punishing a student for a mistake is my responsibility, not something a student like you should handle." The protagonist realized he was dealing with someone of equal or greater intelligence. The assistant professor smiled upon hearing the banter, and the vice director thought that, Regardless of the nonsense people said, his opponent was strong. The student then said, "If the director is right and I have violated the authority of the teachers, I apologize. But in any case, I am willing to accept the punishment for what I have done." The vice director was satisfied upon hearing this. The director nodded and said, "Everything is fine. I wasn't asking to discuss punishment in the first place." Those words relieved the protagonist, but the assistant professor was left speechless. Zien thought he understood. Believed that the young man had the eloquence to win the favor of a constellation, he announced to everyone that he would accept Ban Yuan's self-defense as justified. Those words made Light and Rutel happy. The assistant professor even tried to argue with the vice director, who ordered him to stand still and stop that disgraceful behavior. Moreover, the assistant professor was scolded for not handling the students properly. He hadn't shown the necessary discipline during the match and was told that dealing with his right arm was an easy fix, ending the matter. A notice was given for the students watching the match to return to their seats. While the announcements were being made, Dao was relieved that everything had ended without further incidents, and Light agreed with her. The director also said that the student band had put in a lot of effort and could leave at that moment. Showing respect, he bowed to the assistant professor, who was fuming with rage at that moment, and left. He was turning to leave when he seemed to notice something. The communicator still displayed, "See you later." However, when he turned and looked, there was no message on the screen. Ban felt like it was happening again. After the incident, he joined his friends who were happy to have him back. Light said that the sword strikes he used at the end were incredible. The protagonist replied, "It must have been because of the tower." Yu praised him, saying, "I enjoyed watching. You've really grown stronger." She then asked, "How does it feel to gain a new power? Do you find it useful?" Feeling a bit awkward, he scratched his head and replied, "It's all because you trained me so diligently." Du embarrassed him when she brought up the stone man's arm. "I know you absorbed it," she said, making him uneasy. That revelation reminded him of when he was in the arena and the message appeared. He hadn't thought it was possible. The system message had shown several possibilities for him to choose from. Just to be safe, he had only taken a little. When it worked, he found it unbelievable. He had taken a bit of each and realized that all the traits were incredibly strong. Up until that moment, he hadn't been able to freely manipulate the concept of living people. He told his friends, "I can now extract specific parts by cutting them." His expression turned sad as he continued, "I ended up absorbing the strength of my opponent's right arm." Du asked, "Isn't that a good thing? Why are you pretending it isn't?" He sighed and said, "At first, I was happy to be getting stronger. But then, upon realizing it, he wasn't actually fighting the same monster as before." He shared with his friends that after everything, he felt abnormal and uncomfortable. The white-haired young woman shouting told him to lift his head because there was no reason to say such nonsense. She reminded him that the opponent had been attacking him with murderous intent the entire time. She told the protagonist that in a life-or-death situation, he should know what the choice would be. Her words brought some comfort to the protagonist, hearing her say that he shouldn't feel guilty for making his choice. After calming down a bit, he said he had been overthinking things and apologized to his friends. Tu told him that he couldn't just go around cutting off the arms of those in the so-called special class. While the girls were arguing, he seemed to have received a message that made him extremely worried, even causing him to shout. His sudden yelling startled his friends, who were left confused and unsure of what was happening. There was an additional mandatory cost, the course on the constellations of Babylon, taught by Professor Sina. He taught how to effectively gain the support of constellations and how to negotiate contracts with them. This knowledge and preparation were useful to avoid the wrath of the constellations. Now that course was being offered to Class 11. Everyone watched as the people from the lower dimensions started passing by. It was said that the bargainer boy was walking around with his head held high, and the protagonist felt uncomfortable with the stairs. As the protagonist and his friends climbed the stairs, they overheard various comments from people who were both in favor of and against them. Looking back, he saw that all his friends were upset and apprehensive about the remarks. With a mysterious expression, he told his friends, "More people are cursed the longer they live." As he walked, he was suddenly pulled by the wrist by Rupel, who seemed to want to talk to him. She was worried about what had happened the previous day and feared that more people would start to dislike them. Upset, she said, "Everyone speaks whatever they want without even knowing what kind of person you are." Seeing the sadness in her eyes, the protagonist tried to reassure her, telling her that everything was fine. Placing his hand on her head, he asked her not to worry too much about those things, and he thanked her for all the kindness she was showing him. However, those who were watching them were pleased with that level of intimacy. Light and Du thought it was unnecessary. They had already gone out together over the weekend, and now they were perfectly in sync. Du asked the pink-haired young woman, "Did you like the clothes you received that much?" Rel, who usually remains silent in the face of teasing, turned to Du and asked, "Are you jealous?" The question left the protagonist flustered. Du got angry and shot back, haven't you gotten tired of being beaten by me yet? Rel made it clear, I know you'll keep hitting me one way or another. Standing at the door, they observed if this was indeed the classroom for the Babylonian Khan, Asian's course. Light was sure there had been a class last week, but he wasn't sure what would happen if people like them mixed with the others. He feared what the senior students might think, but the protagonist reassured them. Don't worry about that. Summoning his courage, he gripped the door handle, preparing to open it and begin participating in the course. He responded to Light, saying everyone will just think talented juniors are joining them. But as he opened the door, even the protagonist showed signs of nervousness at the sheer number of people inside. All eyes turned toward them as the door opened, seemingly analyzing each of them. Hugh thought that since they were older and more experienced, even she couldn't ignore their skills. The pink-haired young woman was visibly intimidated, as was Light. The protagonist also didn't feel comfortable with all those people around him. As soon as Zan saw the students, he welcomed Class 11 to his lecture. The protagonist, looking at the vice director, couldn't understand what his power was. Nothing about him was revealed, and when the man spoke, the protagonist noticed that his voice was the same as in the duel. Sena began by saying that the purpose of his classes was to understand the tower and the constellations. He told the people who joined the class that day that he would first talk about the tower. He started by saying that at first glance, it seemed like a massive structure without descriptive principles or ends, but he explained that the tower was no different from a living organism. To the protagonist, the lecture seemed somewhat boring. Seon explained that it might seem like they were simply claiming rewards for clearing rooms. However, he stated that this was not the case. It wasn't that they found some rewards and the tower willingly gave them. The tower did this to distinguish the most outstanding climbers among all, and for those individuals, it granted even greater and more exceptional treasures. There were also transcendences such as mediums, which were a basic condition for any intelligent being to reason like a superior entity. It was a fragile system, one that could be turned upside down by a single irregular intruder using non-standard routes. All the professor's talk sounded like nonsense. The protagonist didn't believe any of it. Although he remained silent, he was always thinking about something. That was when the Chancellor's mass email was sent. The protagonist remembered that this happened shortly after the intruder entered the tower. What if the irregular phenomenon with the swarm of SPs in Room 4 had been caused by the intruder? The problem was the difficulty seemed strange even in Room 1, where those creatures were definitely elite monsters. It was odd if the tower had only started behaving strangely after they reached Room 4 and the introduction began. With that, the strange things that happened in Rooms 1, 2, and 3 couldn't be explained. Now, with the professor saying that the tower could be a living organism, things seemed to make more sense. If he changed his perspective, maybe the tower wasn't changing the difficulty solely because of the intruder. Instead, it was because everyone had started climbing. That solution seemed easier to accept. Now, he didn't know if the insane difficulty was really the tower thinking for itself and imposing challenges. There was a moment when the protagonist was so deep in thought that his friends beside him started to notice. So did the professor, who, although he didn't say anything at first, smiled, thinking that he was getting closer to his goal. The protagonist was already sweating from thinking so much, but he still insisted, believing that if the tower was a system, it would choose these people. As Professor N had said, with that in mind, he looked around and felt there was no better place. He thought that his class had encountered difficulties in situations unlike any other. He believed that if that was the case, the second phase would be even better. More gold, more events, and magical items. He was reflecting on the concept of what was happening inside the tower's rooms when someone asked if he had figured it out yet. The professor, having drawn the protagonist's attention, said that there was a barrier around them and that many students hadn't discovered it yet. He then congratulated Ban and Rutschel for finding an orb on the first day of class. With that, he announced to everyone present that Class 11 was fully qualified to continue attending the lectures. Xenon raised his hand and tossed something into the air. Soon after, a poor violet orb landed. The professor said, "I have a question for you, Ban." He asked, "What do you see when you look at that sphere?" Even after staring for a while, Ban couldn't see anything. It was immeasurable, unknown. Being honest, he admitted, "I don't see anything." The professor urged, "Concentrate a little more and check again." Despite Ban insisting that he still couldn't see anything, the professor pushed him, "Focus harder. There must be something you can perceive." Ban tried, but the only words he could grasp were immeasurable and unknown. He was supposed to uncover the secret of that orb, and for a moment his eyes widened. With that, he managed to see the core concepts of the orb: barriers, separation, and protection. He mentioned, "Beyond that, there's something I can't understand." The professor said, "Close your eyes and rest." The assistant professor simply smiled, thinking that the young student had discovered 3 of the orb's main abilities. Van, rubbing his eyes and looking tired, now understood why the director had so much faith in him. Pointing at the orb, Violator asked the protagonist if he had figured out what it was. Being honest, Van admitted that he had no idea, which made the professor say that he was very straightforward. Shannon said that he wanted to emphasize to everyone the importance of expanding their thoughts and stimulating their imagination. He also mentioned that if they wanted to use their abilities in an advanced way, they needed to develop the power of thought. The driving forces behind it all, he added. At that moment, the protagonist didn't understand what any of this had to do with the orb. He wanted to know if someone with high cognitive ability or imagination could control it. Shannon agreed. If one day someone had the ability to understand, analyze, and develop themselves, he said, they would be able to expand this capacity. Smiling with a strange tone in his voice, the professor continued, when someone achieves that, the orb will turn them into a pseudo-god. The professor's words were exaggerated and unsettling, and the students stared at him. But to the protagonist, everything remained incredibly tedious. The professor insisted, saying at the moment it might be difficult to understand, and he explained that as the lecture progressed, everyone would gradually come to grasp it. Finishing a lecture, he assigned them the task of trying to imagine the possible applications of everything that had been discussed. From beginning to end, the protagonist found the lecture extremely complicated. A question lingered in his mind. If God was God, then what was a pseudo-god? He didn't know if it was something similar to a god or just a false imitation. His thoughts were interrupted when Light called Ban to leave. Meanwhile, Ban was asking someone from his class to explain the lecture again because he hadn't understood it. At the same time, Light said he had expected the protagonist to summarize it well, but his eyes widened in shock as he looked ahead, seeing Ortima. Once he recovered from the shock, he managed to ask, "What are you doing here?" The rough-looking young man responded that he was the one asking the questions. He wanted to know where she was, and Light could hardly believe that he was referring to their classmate. Suddenly, Du arrived, asking why everyone was gathered together. Smiling, she sarcastically said, "I thought something serious had happened." The protagonist, feeling awkward and not wanting things to escalate, didn't quite know what to say. Ortima stepped closer to the white-haired young woman and confirmed, "Is your name Deco?" He said he had business to discuss with her. She continued mocking him. "Are you making another duel request? If you want to hurt me, I won't stop you." He fixated on her, saying that dueling inside the academy seemed difficult. While she spoke, the young man suddenly dropped to one knee and told her it's not a duel request. He pulled out a beautiful bouquet of flowers and offered them to the furious young woman standing before him, leaving everyone shocked. Ortima asked the young woman on a date, his face turning red with embarrassment. The people behind him, their eyes wide in disbelief, never imagined such a scene was possible. Just like them, the cold-hearted young woman also showed no expression.